Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Fiction Moon, presenting to you today, what if Harry was a reincarnated Arcane Emperor and rebuilt the Potter Empire from beneath Hogwarts? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Weight of Stone. The train had been moving for 3 hours before Harry noticed the castle in his bones. Not in his eyes. Hogwarts was still invisible, still somewhere ahead in the Scottish dark, but there was a pressure building behind his sternum, low and constant, like a second heartbeat that wasn't quite synced with his own. He'd felt strange things before. The cupboard under the stairs had always been colder than the rest of the house, and sometimes in the deepest part of night he'd wake up with the absolute certainty that something enormous was waiting for him to remember it. The Dursleys had called it nightmares. Harry had always suspected it was something else entirely. He sat alone in a compartment for most of the journey. He hadn't meant to be alone. A round-faced boy named Neville had poked his head in early on, looking for a toad, and Harry had helped him search 3 cars before Trevor was located behind a toilet in the second-to-last carriage. Neville had looked at Harry with the sort of grateful, slightly stunned expression that people usually reserve for being pulled out of oncoming traffic, and Harry had felt something pull in his chest, a warmth he didn't have a name for yet. "You didn't have to help," Neville said, cradling the toad. "I know," Harry said, and meant it. He'd wanted to. Neville had gone back to sit with someone else, a girl with a loud voice and a tendency to already know answers to questions nobody had asked yet. Harry had returned to his compartment, leaned his forehead against the cool glass, and watched England turn into Scotland while that second heartbeat kept its quiet, insistent rhythm. He was 11 years old. He had a trunk full of books, a wand of holly and phoenix feather that had felt in his hand like something recognizing itself, and a scar on his forehead that made adults go strange and silent whenever they noticed it. He had grown up in a cupboard and been told he was nothing and had believed it, mostly, because children believe what they're told until they find a reason not to. Harry was starting to find reasons. The second heartbeat grew stronger as the train curved north, and by the time they crossed some invisible threshold, some boundary Harry couldn't name but felt as clearly as a change in air pressure, it was no longer behind his sternum but inside his skull, his hands, the soles of his feet. Like something sleeping in the earth below had exhaled, and he'd breathed the same breath. He didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. And even if there had been, he wasn't sure what words he would have used. He just watched the window, and felt the land watching back. The boats were someone's idea of magic for first years, and Harry could see why. The castle rose from the dark water and the dark sky like it had always been there and always would be, which was true in a way that most truths weren't. Torches burned in towers. Reflections shivered on the black lake. Around him, 11-year-olds made small sounds of wonder, and Harry understood those sounds, felt the same catch in his throat. But underneath all of it, he felt the stone. Not the stone of the walls or the towers, something deeper. Older. Bedrock deep, geological deep, the kind of stone that hadn't moved since before there were words for things not moving. It hummed. Or not hummed, exactly, it resonated at a frequency slightly below sound, something felt rather than heard, and it was specifically, precisely directed at him, the way a voice in a crowd calls your name and you turn before you've consciously processed the sound. Harry's hands tightened on the edge of the boat. Hermione Granger, 3 boats ahead of him, was talking animatedly to a girl whose name Harry hadn't caught, reciting details about Hogwarts from a book she'd read at least twice. Her voice carried beautifully across the water. She was right about everything she said. It barely scratched the surface. The stone kept calling. He didn't run when they reached the shore. He walked with everyone else, climbed the steps, waited in the entrance hall while Professor McGonagall delivered her welcome speech with the crisp precision of someone who had given it many times and still meant every word. Harry liked her immediately and couldn't have explained exactly why, something about the way she looked at all of them, assessing, not unkind, like she was already quietly deciding which of them were worth the extra effort. Her eyes landed on Harry for just a moment longer than the others. He didn't look away. She led them through tall doors into the great hall, and Harry stopped breathing for a moment. For long tables stretched the length of the hall, hundreds of candles floating overhead, the ceiling charmed to mirror the cloudy October sky. It was extraordinary. It was beautiful. Harry registered all of this in the way you register a stunning view while simultaneously realizing the ground under your feet is shaking, awareness without attention, because his attention was somewhere else entirely. Below the flagstones. Below the cellars. Below whatever the founders had built on, below the bedrock and the clay and the ancient compressed memory of 1,000 years. Something was awake down there. Something that knew he was here. The sorting hat was older than it looked, which was saying something because it looked approximately as old as the concept of hats itself. It sat on a stool at the front of the hall like a relic that had somehow outlasted the museum it belonged in. When it sang its annual song, cataloguing the 4 houses with a poet's sense of self-satisfaction, Harry listened to the words and also listened to the space underneath the words, the way you can listen to music and also hear the room it's played in. He was near the front of the alphabet. His name was called, the hall went electric with the kind of silence that is actually incredibly loud, and Harry walked up to the stool and sat down and let Professor McGonagall lower the hat over his eyes. The world went dim. "Well," said a voice. It was not the voice Harry had expected. He'd thought the hat might be imperious, or theatrical, or old in the way that made things slow and stiff. Instead it was simply, attentive. The way an old professor sounds when they find a student who finally asks the question they've been waiting 3 decades for someone to ask. "Well, well, well," it said again. "Now this is something I haven't encountered in a very, very long time." Harry waited. "You know," the hat continued, conversationally, "I've sorted 11,243 students. Give or take. Some of them were remarkable. A handful were genuinely extraordinary. But you," a pause that stretched, that deepened, that felt less like hesitation and more like the hat pressing its metaphorical ear against a wall to listen more carefully, "you are something else. Is that a problem?" Harry asked, inside his head. Problem? No. A complication, perhaps. The hat seemed to move, or to lean. "Do you know what you are, child?" "I'm Harry Potter." "Yes," said the hat, and somehow it made the confirmation sound like a footnote. "You are. You're also something considerably older. The stone remembers you, you know. I could feel it from the moment you stepped into the hall." The whole castle shivered. "Did you feel it?" Harry said nothing. Which was answer enough. "You have courage, real courage, not the performed kind, not bravado. You have a mind that could outrun almost anyone in this building, if you let it. You have loyalty so deep it barely knows itself yet. And underneath all of that." The hat went somewhere Harry couldn't follow for just a moment, somewhere deep and lateral and vast, and when it came back its voice had changed slightly, become quieter. "You have something I have no name for. Something that was old when this castle was a forest." The hall was very, very quiet outside. Harry could feel the silence pressing against the hat's fabric. "Gryffindor," the hat said, but it said it low, private, before it said anything else, and then, softer still, right against the innermost shell of Harry's ear, "Welcome back, Emperor." Then the hat's brim flew up and it shouted to the hall, "Gryffindor." The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry slid off the stool, handed the hat back to Professor McGonagall, who was watching him with an expression that was almost startled, and walked to his new table while the applause washed over him like weather. He sat down. Smiled at the people around him. Let the moment carry. But underneath the flagstones of the great hall, 60 feet below where anyone had been in 1,000 years, something ancient and silent and patient finally relaxed. Gryffindor Tower that night was loud in the way that only 11-year-olds in a shared dormitory can be loud, questions and exclamations and laughter and the occasional sound of someone's trunk refusing to cooperate. Harry sat on his bed and listened to all of it and felt, for the first time in his memory, something that might have been at home. Not the place. He wasn't naive about places. The common room was warm and the dormitory was decent and the bed was better than anything he'd slept in at the Dursleys, but none of that was what he meant. What he meant was the particular quality of noise around him, people existing without cruelty, without hierarchy designed to diminish, without the low constant threat that the Dursley house had always carried in its walls. Just people being people, chaotic and ordinary and occasionally irritating. Ron Weasley was in the bed next to his, and he was currently embroiled in a good-natured argument with Seamus Finnegan about whether the Sorting Hat had been slower than usual or whether it just felt that way because of the tension. Harry let the argument happen past him and thought about what the Hat had said. "Welcome back, Emperor." He turned the phrase over in his mind the way you test the temperature of water before stepping in. It didn't feel strange. That was the thing. It didn't feel strange at all, and he thought it probably should have, and the fact that it didn't told him something he wasn't quite ready to sit down and examine directly. He knew things he shouldn't know. He'd always known things. He knew the properties of ash and elder before he'd read a word of magical theory. He knew that the crack in a wand's handle changed its resonance without being told. He knew, standing in Ollivander's shop with holly and phoenix feather humming in his grip, that the wand was good but not his best option, that somewhere, waiting, there were tools built specifically for him, built by hands that had once been his own hands, and that patience would bring him to them. He knew the land. He'd felt it on the train, in the boats, in the hall. Old land, deep land, land that kept records the way water keeps the shape of what it's moved around. And below Hogwarts was something that had called him by a name the Sorting Hat shouldn't have known. Harry stared at the ceiling of his four-poster bed for a long time. Then he closed his eyes, and slept, and dreamed in a language that had no alphabet. He found the passage on his third night. Not because he'd been searching systematically, not because he'd followed a map or a clue. He'd woken up at 2 a.m. with that sub-bass resonance vibrating in his back teeth, louder than it had been since the train, and he'd gotten out of bed and pulled on shoes and a jumper and walked out of the dormitory with the absolute certainty of a man who has been told the exact time and location of an appointment he cannot miss. The castle was different at night. Not dangerous, exactly, but present in a way it wasn't when full of students. The portraits slept or pretended to. The staircases moved in long, unhurried cycles that felt less like magic and more like the breathing of something vast. Harry walked without a candle and did not trip and did not get lost, which he noted as interesting and filed for later consideration. He went down. Not because he'd decided to go down, but because down was where it was pulling him, not a compulsion, nothing controlling, more like gravity, the pull of water toward low ground, simply the path of least resistance for something that wanted to go in a particular direction. The dungeon stairs. The second dungeon stairs. A corridor that curved in a way that shouldn't have been geometrically possible given the corridor it branched from, and at the end of that corridor, a wall. Not an unusual wall. Flagstone, torchlit, damp in the particular way that castle dungeons are always damp regardless of the weather outside. But Harry put his hand against it and felt the resonant spike, felt it answer his touch the way a bell answers a strike, and the wall shimmered once and quietly stopped being a wall. An archway. Carved stone, the edges worn smooth with age, the keystone inscribed with a mark that Harry's hand went to automatically, 2 overlapping circles and a vertical line, a sigil that meant nothing in any book in the Hogwarts library because it predated those books by centuries. He traced it with one finger and felt something click, not in the stone but somewhere behind his eyes. Beyond the archway, stairs. Going down. Harry went down. The air changed immediately, warmer, drier, carrying the particular stillness of a space that has been sealed and maintained by magic rather than abandoned and decayed. The walls here were cut differently from Hogwarts stone, the lines cleaner, older in technique if not in material, the kind of stonework that spoke of someone who understood weight and pressure and had strong opinions about both. Runes ran along the base of the wall, not decorative, structural, the magical equivalent of load-bearing architecture, glyphs of containment and preservation and direction woven so deeply into the stone they were practically geological. Harry read them. He shouldn't have been able to read them. They were in a system that predated any runic tradition covered in Hogwarts curriculum. Professor Babbling, who taught ancient runes, would have needed months and a research partner to make sense of a single line. Harry read them the way you read your own handwriting, with the automatic comprehension of authorship. First ring, preservation. The air, the stone, the materials within. Unchanged. Second ring, recognition. Access only to the blood of the hand that carved. Not locked, simply restricted, like a door that only opens for one key and doesn't bother with guards. Third ring, alert. If the one who carries the blood passes through, wake the lumen. Harry's footsteps echoed as the stairs leveled out into a landing, and then into a hall. The hall was not what he'd expected, and he couldn't have said what he had expected, but this was larger than expectation, a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow, archways leading off into side chambers, a floor of dark stone inlaid with a map in silver and gold that, Harry realized slowly, was not a map of the castle above but a map of this underground structure, spreading outward in a pattern that was roughly circular, organized around a central point somewhere further ahead. Books. Shelves of them, physical shelves in alcoves and also something else, cases of crystal with texts preserved in suspension, the magical equivalent of laminated documents. Instruments Harry had no names for, because the names for them existed only in his own former vocabulary. A long table of dark wood. A forge, cold now, but maintained, no rust, no dust, the bellows intact, the tools racked with military precision. And in the center of the hall, on a plinth of black stone about chest height, a sphere of light. It was not large, the size of an orange, perhaps, and it was not bright, a warm amber gold that threw more atmosphere than illumination. But it pulsed, slow and steady, and when Harry walked toward it, it pulsed faster, and faster still, and by the time he was arm's length from the plinth it was throwing light in sharp rhythmic bursts like a distress signal, like a heart recognizing footsteps. Then it stilled. And spoke. 23 years, 11 months, and 16 days, it said. The voice was androgynous, warm, carrying the particular quality of something that has been waiting a long time and is very deliberately not being dramatic about it. Since the last Potter walked these halls, I'd begun to wonder. Harry looked at the sphere for a long moment. Your lumen, he said. A pause, brief but loaded with something that might have been surprised pleasure. You remember that much already. Just the name. He moved closer. What are you? What I am is somewhat philosophically complex and probably not the most pressing conversation we need to have tonight. The light shifted, warmer. What I am functionally is an advisor, a record keeper, and the most sophisticated magical construct your former self ever built. I was designed to assist, inform, and, if necessary, argue with the Arcane Emperor. The last function proved the most frequently necessary. A beat. I have been alone for a long time, and I would appreciate it if you didn't make a habit of keeping me waiting. Something turned over in Harry's chest. Not nostalgia, he hadn't earned nostalgia yet, hadn't recovered enough to miss what he didn't remember clearly. But something adjacent to it, something warm and slightly aching. I'm not him, Harry said. No, Lumen agreed, without argument or consolation. You're not. You're someone who carries what he was inside someone who is entirely new. That's more interesting, honestly. Aldrich was formidable. But he was also, and I say this with great affection for his memory, occasionally catastrophically stubborn in ways that created entirely preventable problems. A pause. I have hopes that you will be catastrophically stubborn in more productive directions. Harry almost smiled. What do you need to tell me? Several things, Lumen said. In order of urgency. The sphere brightened slightly. The seals are weakening. Slowly, we have time, but not unlimited time. Your arrival has stabilized them somewhat, they respond to your presence the way a wound responds to proper treatment, better just from the right person being in proximity. But they will require active attention. Soon. What's sealed? We'll get to that. It's a long conversation and you should sit down for it, and we should have it when you have more than 6 hours before you need to be in charms. A practical note entered the voice. Second, someone has placed a cursed object in the castle. I detected it 3 days ago. It is not the work of a student. The curse structure is old, deliberate, and designed not to harm directly but to probe. To test the seal's integrity from above, like pressing on a bruise to locate the source of the pain. Harry's eyes sharpened. Who? I don't know who placed it. I know why. Someone above knows something is down here. They know the seals exist. They want to know if they're failing. Lumen's light flickered, briefly. They've known for a long time. They've been waiting. How long have they been waiting? That, Lumen said, is the third and most complicated item on tonight's agenda. And it connects to something you should understand about your family's history, about what the name Potter actually means and what it was built to carry, and I'd like to start from the beginning and not from the middle, so please sit down, Harry. Harry sat on the edge of the long dark table. He was 11 years old, and he had been at Hogwarts for exactly 3 days, and somewhere above him several hundred children were sleeping peacefully through what was probably the most important conversation this castle had ever contained. Lumen began to speak. He stayed for 2 hours. He didn't hear everything, not in the sense of Lumen withholding, but in the sense of there being too much and him being too young for certain weights to land cleanly yet. He understood the broad shapes of things, the way you understand the outline of a continent from far above before you've walked any of its ground. The Potters were caretakers. Had been for centuries, going back before the family had a name anyone outside their line would recognize, back to when the name was Ashvale and carried an authority that entire nations had organized themselves around. The vault beneath the castle was Aldrich's construction, his library, his forge, his record, his life's work in the form of a physical space. And at the center of the vault, deeper than Harry had yet gone, was the cradle, a sealed chamber containing the thing Aldrich had died to contain. Not a person. Not a creature. A wound in reality itself, a tear in the fabric of magical existence that had been opened, accidentally, Lumen thought, though the history was complicated, during a moment of catastrophic magical overload several thousand years ago. Aldrich had sealed it. The sealing had cost him his life, or rather his continuity. His body was gone, but his magical signature was so deeply woven into the seal that his consciousness had been preserved in fragments, scattered forward in time, reassembling itself into living form every few generations in the nearest compatible bloodline. The Potters. James Potter had never known. His father had died too young, before the knowledge could be passed. The chain had broken. And so James had lived and died without knowing what his blood carried, what his family name was built on, what was sleeping underneath the school his son would attend. Harry sat with all of this for a moment. The cursed object, he finally said. Where is it? Third floor corridor, Lumen said. Behind a locked door. Interestingly, that area has been additionally warded by someone in the castle, I'd say a professor, possibly the headmaster. They've put something in there deliberately. Whether to protect the cursed object or protect against it, I can't say. Harry thought about this. I'll look tomorrow. I'd recommend discretion. I'm always discreet. A pause. You are 11 years old and you just spent 2 hours in a secret underground vault that shouldn't be accessible to anyone alive. You have a rather generous definition of discretion. I didn't tell anyone. You walked through a populated castle in the middle of the night. No one saw me. Another pause, different in quality, Lumen computing something. How did you avoid the portraits? Harry thought about it. I don't know. They were asleep. Portraits don't sleep, Lumen said carefully. They rest with awareness. Several are specifically tasked with monitoring night movement. A long beat. Harry. Did you consciously do anything to avoid being observed? Harry thought about it more carefully. He had walked through the castle with the certainty of direction, the pull of resonance, the sensation of moving through space that was cooperating with him rather than simply containing him. He had not thought about the portraits. He had simply, the castle, he said slowly. Yes, Lumen said, and the amber light warmed by several degrees. The castle knows you. And apparently it was already acting on that knowledge. That's, a pause that felt, for the first time, genuinely uncertain, faster than I expected. Much faster. You only arrived 3 days ago. Is that a problem? It's data, Lumen said. I don't know yet whether it's a problem. It suggests your integration is moving quickly, which could mean several things. The light steadied. Go to bed, Harry. You have transfiguration at 8. Harry stood up from the table. He looked around the hall once more, the shelves, the forge, the archways leading into the dark of deeper chambers, the floor map gleaming faintly in the amber light. All of it. Built by hands he had once had, arranged with logic he could feel the ghost of even now, waiting for him with the patient certainty of a place that had never doubted his return. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, Lumen agreed. And Harry. He paused at the foot of the stairs. I am very glad you're here. Harry put his hand briefly against the carved stone of the archway as he passed through it. The wall reformed behind him without a sound. He walked back through the castle, and the castle, true to apparently recent form, let him pass unremarked, the shadows cooperative, the stairs steady, the portraits lost in their slumbering dreams. He slid back into his dormitory bed at 3:30 in the morning. Ron made a sound in his sleep. Seamus muttered something that might have been Quidditch-related. Dean turned over. Neville's toad croaked once from whatever corner Trevor had claimed. Harry stared at the ceiling. Below the flagstones of the castle, 60 feet below, then further, then deeper, Lumen pulsed its amber light in the empty hall and waited for morning with the patience of something that had already waited 1,000 years and knew that the wait was finally, truly over. Harry closed his eyes. He slept without dreaming this time. Just dark, and warmth, and the deep subsonic hum of ancient stone that remembered him, steady as a heartbeat, steady as the turning of the earth. Classes were, in their way, revelatory. Not in the sense Harry had expected. He hadn't expected to be bored, exactly, but he had expected a certain gap between what he already seemed to know and what was being taught. What surprised him was how interesting the instruction was anyway, not because of the material but because of what the material revealed about how magic was being understood in the current era. Professor Flitwick's introduction to the Wingardium Leviosa charm was, technically, an introduction to one of the most fundamental physical interactions in Western magical tradition, the marriage of will to structure, intent made kinetic. Flitwick taught it cheerfully, precisely, with genuine delight in the subject and his students, and what he taught was correct as far as it went. He just didn't go very far. The charm was treated as a discrete skill, learned by rote, the mechanism entirely opaque. This motion, this pronunciation, this intent, this result. It worked. It was useful. It left almost everything about why it worked completely unexplored. Harry did it on his third try, which was not remarkable. Hermione Granger did it on her first, which was, and he watched her face when the feather rose and saw the specific quality of her joy, not just success but confirmation, the joy of someone whose hypothesis proved right rather than just lucky. He liked that. He filed it. He did it differently on his third try. Not wrongly, the feather rose as required, but he adjusted the wrist motion slightly, changed the emphasis in the incantation, and felt the charm lock in with a precision and efficiency that the standard form missed by about 12%. He didn't say this aloud. He just noted it, the way you note a spelling error in a text that's been in circulation too long to correct. McGonagall's Transfiguration class was where Harry found himself genuinely absorbed, leaning forward, following not just the lesson but the mathematical structure underneath it. The relationship between caster and object during transformation, the moment of informational overlap, where the target's physical reality accepted a new template, was one of the most elegant things Aldrich had worked with, and sitting in McGonagall's classroom Harry felt flickers of that old fascination, warm and immediate, like embers rather than memory. He transformed his match to a needle on his second attempt, which drew a small, precise compliment from McGonagall and a slightly suspicious look that Harry met with a face of complete blankness. He had learned, already, which reactions to minimize. Not because he was hiding. Not because he was afraid of standing out. But because there was a difference between power and performance, and standing out as a clever first year was performance. What he was doing, what he needed to keep doing, was entirely different in kind, and it would not serve him to invite scrutiny before he was ready for the conversation that scrutiny would inevitably lead to. Hermione sat 2 seats away in Transfiguration and watched his needle with an expression Harry recognized because he'd seen its mirror on his own face when Lumen had been speaking the previous night. It was the look of someone connecting something they knew to something they didn't and finding the overlap more interesting than either thing separately. She glanced at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything. She was going to follow him, he realized. Not yet. But eventually. She was too curious about too many things not to notice that something here didn't add up, and she was too rigorous to leave something that didn't add up unexamined. He didn't know how to feel about that yet, so he turned his attention back to the needle in his hand and thought about crystalline structure and information overlap and the way magic always found the most efficient path when you let it. The 3rd-floor corridor was locked with a straightforward spell and a more interesting secondary ward that Harry recognized as Dumbledore's work, not from any direct knowledge but from the texture of it, the layering, the habit of mind it revealed. Careful. Layered. Designed with the assumption that a curious student might test it and should be discouraged rather than harmed. Protective in the manner of someone who thinks about consequences. Harry stood outside the door for 30 seconds. He didn't try it. He just felt it, the ward, and beneath the ward, what Lumen had described. The cursed object on the other side had a signature like a compass pointing at the floor, a sustained magical inquiry directed downward, probing. Lumen had been right. It wasn't a weapon. It was a question. Harry memorized the signature of it, etched it into his own awareness with the same careful attention he'd applied to the runes in the vault, and walked away. He had what he needed. The question the cursed object was asking was actually helpful, in a way. It told him the shape of what the people above were looking for, which told him something about what they knew. They knew the seals existed. They knew they were weakening. They knew Hogwarts was the locus. They didn't know he was here. Not yet. He turned the corner and nearly walked directly into Draco Malfoy, who was coming from the other direction with Crabbe and Goyle in his customary flanking formation, like quotation marks around a thought that thought too highly of itself. Potter. Malfoy's eyes went to the locked door and back. What are you doing up here? Looking at a door, Harry said, which was technically true. That corridor is off limits. I know. I didn't go in. Harry looked at Malfoy with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who is genuinely curious about what's in front of him. What are you doing up here? Malfoy's jaw moved slightly. He clearly hadn't expected the question reflected back. I'm a prefect, we're allowed, you're a first year, Harry said, not unkindly. Same as me. Crabbe and Goyle shifted their weight in unison. Malfoy looked at Harry for a moment with an expression Harry hadn't expected, underneath the performative certainty, a flicker of something genuinely assessing. He was smarter than he performed, Harry noted. Smarter and more uncertain, and the gap between those two things was where most of his personality lived. You're not what I expected, Malfoy said finally. No, Harry agreed. Most people say that. He stepped around Malfoy and Crabbe and Goyle and walked back toward the main staircase. He heard Malfoy's footsteps hesitate behind him, as if Draco had something else he'd planned to say and was now reconsidering its relevance. Harry didn't look back. A week in, he found Neville sitting on a bench in the entrance hall at 7 in the morning, which was early for anyone and especially early for Neville, who had established himself in the dormitory as someone who treated mornings with a suspicious hostility. Trevor the Toad was on his knee. Neville was looking at nothing in particular with an expression Harry was learning to recognize, the face of someone who has been told something about themselves so many times that they've started believing it's geological fact rather than opinion. Harry sat down next to him without being invited. Neville looked up. "Oh. Hi. Morning." Harry watched the entrance hall for a moment. The enchanted ceiling was doing something with morning light that made the space feel enormous. "What's wrong?" Neville's expression flickered through surprise, then embarrassment, then something more honest. "My Gran wrote." Harry waited. "She thinks I'm," Neville paused, reorganized. "She doesn't think I should be in Gryffindor. She thinks there's been a mistake." He said it flatly, not fishing for reassurance, which Harry found was actually rather admirable. "She says my father was a true Gryffindor and I'm more like his furniture than his son." Harry looked at Neville. Not quickly, not performing consideration, actually looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the way he was holding the toad and the specific quality of the embarrassment, which was not shame but the experience of someone who's had a wound pressed on so many times they've started thinking the soreness is normal. "She's wrong," Harry said. Neville made a small sound. "Not a comforting you wrong," Harry said. "And actually wrong. Different things." He thought about how to say the next part. "Courage isn't about not being afraid. Everybody's afraid. What makes it Gryffindor is that you help find someone's toad when you've never met them and you don't have to, and you get up at 7 in the morning and sit with your feelings instead of ignoring them, and you say the hard true thing instead of the comfortable easy one." He paused. "That's the realest kind of courage. It's just not dramatic, so people miss it." Neville stared at him. "I'm not making that up," Harry said. "I know," Neville said, slowly. "You don't really make things up, do you?" It was an observation, not a question. Harry thought it was one of the most perceptive things a person had said to him since Lumen, which given the company Lumen was in terms of general wisdom, was saying quite a lot. "Not about important things," Harry said. Trevor made a sound. Neville patted him absently. "How do you know what's important?" Harry thought about Lumen, the vault, the resonance in the stone, the calling his name before he arrived, the hat whispering "Welcome back Emperor" in the hush of 400 waiting children. "It usually announces itself," he said. On the night that ended his first week, Harry went back down. He moved through the castle with the same wordless cooperation from the shadows and stones, the same unhurried certainty of direction. The archway opened at his touch, the stairs descended, the hall spread its amber light to meet him. Lumen brightened as he crossed the threshold. "You've been in classes," it said. "I have." Harry sat on the table, same as before. "Tell me about the Potter bloodline from the beginning. The full version." "That's several hours of material. I'll come back as often as needed." He looked at the sphere. "I need to understand what I am before I can decide what to do about any of it. I need the whole map before I start walking." Lumen was quiet for a moment, and when it spoke again there was something in the quality of the voice Harry hadn't heard before, not sentimentality, but something close to it, the warm frequency of a thing that has been waiting to be asked the right question by the right person. "Very well," Lumen said. "From the beginning." Outside, above 1,000 years of stone and memory, the Scottish night pressed against the castle walls, and the lake sat black and still, and the stars did what stars do, which is burn enormous and ancient and heedless of the small warm lives below. Inside, 60 feet beneath the great hall, Harry Potter sat in the hall his former self had carved from the bedrock of an old world, and listened to the shape of what he was. Chapter 2, What the Library Remembers. The cursed object moved on a Tuesday. Harry felt it before he saw any evidence of it, a shift in the castle's ambient resonance, subtle as a key change in a piece of music you've been half listening to for a week. He was in charms when it happened, sitting in the third row with his wand loose in his fingers, half following Flitwick's introduction to the softening charm and half listening to the deeper frequency of the building around him. The castle had been talking to him in its way all week, not in words but in texture, warm when he walked certain corridors, tense when he passed certain doors, the architectural equivalent of body language. Tuesday morning it tensed all at once, a full building clench, and Harry looked up from his notes. Flitwick was mid-sentence. Nobody else had reacted. The charm work continued around him, students wrestling with pronunciation, the air filling with small unsuccessful bursts of magical attempt. Hermione 3 rows ahead had already done it perfectly and was now reading ahead in the textbook with the focused intensity of someone who treats a class period as a personal record to beat. Harry set his quill down. The cursed object had moved. He was certain of it, not relocated exactly, but adjusted, rotated perhaps, which meant someone had been in the third-floor corridor, which meant the people probing the seals from above were not operating from a distance. Someone in this castle had moved it deliberately. He picked his quill back up, completed the softening charm on the first try, and did not indicate by any visible expression that anything was different about this moment from any other. After class he went to Lumen. The vault felt different in daylight hours, not because daylight reached it, it didn't, 60 feet of solid stone between the hall and the sky, but because Harry was different in daylight hours, more awake, more precisely himself rather than the half-dreaming version that navigated the castle at 2 in the morning. He moved through the outer hall and stood before Lumen's plinth with his arms crossed and the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that required complete focus. "Someone touched it," he said. "Yes," Lumen said. "Last night, between midnight and 2. They rotated it 17 degrees counterclockwise, which changes the probe vector. They were looking at a different section of the seals, specifically the third ring, the alert ring." A pause. "They know an alert was triggered. They may not know by what. They'll assume it was my arrival." "Almost certainly. The question is whether they know what your arrival means, whether they know what bloodline was triggered, or whether they simply registered a seal response and are trying to understand it." Harry thought about this. The alert ring activates for blood of the Maker. If they know the seal architecture, they know what that means. Yes. So they know a Potter has arrived. They know someone with Ashvale blood has arrived, Lumen corrected. They may or may not connect that to the name Potter. The bloodline records that detailed the Potter-Ashvale connection were destroyed in 1612, I have copies down here, but the copies above are gone. The knowledge exists only in fragments, in very old texts that are either in private collections or, a slight pause, in this library. Harry looked at the archways leading into the side chambers. He'd seen them, catalogued their existence, not yet explored them. The main hall alone had taken several sessions to process properly, the Lumen conversations occupied most of his available time down here, and the Lumen conversations were never short. "How many texts do we have in the primary library collection?" "Approximately 14,000 volumes. Of which perhaps 3,000 predate the founding of Hogwarts, and of those, perhaps 400 are in the original Ashvale script that only you can read." A beat. "There are also texts in here that do not exist anywhere else in the world. Not copies. Originals. Some of them are the only records of things that would fundamentally change the understanding of magical history as it is currently taught." Harry was quiet for a moment, thinking about Hermione Granger in Charms, reading ahead, hungry for everything. How many people could use this library productively? Lumen paused. "In practical terms, someone with exceptional intellectual capacity, a genuine love of learning, no fear of material that challenges established thinking, and the kind of systematic rigor that treats unknown knowledge as a puzzle rather than a threat." Another pause, more deliberate. "Why?" "Because I'm going to need help," Harry said. "I can't do everything alone. Not quickly enough. You have several thousand years of accumulated knowledge and capability sleeping in your blood." "I'm also 11, Harry said. "And there are 14,000 books." He looked at the sphere. "How much of my former memory has come back since I arrived?" Lumen was quiet in a considering way. "Structurally, perhaps 12%. Of that, the accessible, workable portion, the things you can actually use rather than simply feel, is more like 6. "Right." Harry nodded, as if confirming a calculation. "So I need help." "Be careful who you trust, Harry." "I know." He looked at the library archway for a moment. I know exactly who I need. He didn't do anything about it immediately. That was something he'd learned already about himself in this life. He didn't rush toward decisions. He sat with them, tested them, turned them over until he was satisfied that he'd looked at all the angles. It was something Lumen had mentioned once, a little dryly. Aldrich was the same way. He would stare at a problem for 3 days and then solve it in 20 minutes. The staring was the work. He watched Hermione Granger for another week. Not surveillance, he wasn't tracking her movements or cataloging her schedule, nothing that systematic. He simply paid attention to the quality of her attention, which was extraordinary and rather hard to miss once you started looking. She did not just learn things. She metabolized them, breaking each new piece of knowledge down into its components, testing its compatibility with everything she already knew, rebuilding it into her existing understanding at the molecular level. She challenged teachers, politely but without apology, the correction offered in the same register as the question, genuinely trying to get at the right answer rather than prove herself right. She had 4 different notebooks for 4 different organizational systems, and she was currently redesigning one of them because it wasn't meeting her needs. She was also, Harry noticed, lonely in the particular way of people who are significantly smarter than their immediate social environment but haven't yet made peace with that fact. She tried too hard in some directions and not at all in others. She corrected people who hadn't asked to be corrected, which was a social misstep Harry understood because he occasionally felt the same impulse, the almost physical discomfort of watching someone operate on wrong information. She hadn't found the people yet who could match her, and the absence of them had given her edges that were actually just unanswered questions about whether anyone ever would. He caught her eye in the library on a Thursday afternoon, both of them at separate tables, him with a transfiguration essay and a secondary text he'd brought up from the vault that she almost certainly couldn't read but that he was using to cross-reference McGonagall's source material. She looked at the secondary text, which was bound in dark leather with no title on the spine, and he could see the exact moment her mind formulated 6 simultaneous questions about its origin. He turned the book so she couldn't see the script. Her eyes went to his face with a focused curiosity that was almost aggressive in its directness. He smiled, briefly, and looked back at his essay. He heard her quill stop moving. Then, after a moment, restart. Good, he thought. Curiosity was the beginning of everything. He was coming back from the vault on the Thursday of his second week, for in the morning, a long session spent working through the second section of the bloodline records with Lumen, when he realized he wasn't alone in the dungeon corridor. He stopped. The figure was about 40 feet ahead of him, moving slowly, carrying a candle that threw more shadow than light. She was in a Gryffindor dressing gown, hair enormous in the candlelight, a book tucked under one arm, not one book, actually, 2 books and what appeared to be a notebook. She stopped walking and stood in the middle of the corridor and looked at the wall in the exact spot where the archway was not currently an archway. Hermione Granger tilted her head. Reached out and touched the stone with one finger. Harry stayed where he was and watched with the quiet attention of someone who has just had a hypothesis confirmed. She pulled her finger back, looked at it, looked at the wall again, and then turned around. She saw him immediately. The candle lit her face from below. Her expression went through surprise, then rapid reassessment, then, interestingly, something that was neither embarrassed nor apologetic. I followed you, she said, before he could speak. I know, Harry said. Last week. I was awake, I couldn't sleep, I was working through the implications of the counterintuitive mass relationship in Transfiguration and, she stopped herself, reorganized. I saw you leave the dormitory. At 2 in the morning. You walked through the castle like you knew exactly where you were going. I did, Harry said. The portraits didn't wake up. No. That's not normal. She held the candle a little steadier. Portrait monitoring is a standard security function. I read about it in Hogwarts, a history. They're specifically enchanted to report unusual student movement to the head of house. But they didn't wake up when you walked past, which means either they were failing in their function, which is unlikely given that they've operated correctly for centuries, or, she paused, working it out in real time, or the castle was actively cooperating with you. Running interference. Harry looked at her for a moment. You've been following me for a week, he said. I've been trying to follow you for a week, she corrected, with a precision he appreciated. You're very difficult to follow without being detected. Which is also not normal for an 11-year-old. I had to work out your pattern from secondary evidence, when you left the dormitory, how long you were gone, what part of the castle you came back smelling like. She paused. Stone dust and old paper, by the way. You always come back smelling like stone dust and old paper. Harry couldn't help it. He smiled. Hermione's chin came up slightly, like she'd been expecting a different reaction and was recalibrating. This is serious, she said. Whatever is behind that wall, and there is something behind that wall, I can feel a magical boundary even if I can't identify the type, it isn't in any of the castle's official records. I've checked. I've checked all of them. Of course you have, Harry said, not sarcastically, genuinely. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then at the wall, and then made the decision he'd already been moving toward for a week. What I'm going to show you cannot go further than you and me. Not to Ron, not to Neville, not to any teacher, not to anyone. Not yet. When there are more people who need to know, I'll decide who and when. Can you agree to that? Hermione stared at him. You're going to show me? I've been deciding whether to for a week. You've just confirmed my reasoning. He turned to the wall. Stand back slightly. He put his hand to the stone. The archway opened, clean, quiet, the same efficient recognition as every other time. He stepped through and looked back at Hermione, who was standing in the corridor holding her candle with both hands now, the books tucked under her arm, her expression a landscape of controlled amazement. Come in, he said. And try not to ask more than 5 questions simultaneously. I've found that if you let yourself ask more than 5 at once you lose track of which answers you're waiting for. She walked through the archway, and the wall closed behind her, and the amber light of Lumen's hall spread out before them both. Hermione Granger stood perfectly still for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, very quietly, oh. And then, less quietly, oh, what is this, this is incredible, how old is this stonework predates, are those runes? Those aren't any runic system in any published text, how is this, and that, she pointed at the floor map, is that a map of this entire structure? How far does it go? Is that a forge? Why is there a forge? What are all those instruments? Are those books in suspended crystal? I've never seen that preservation technique, that's remarkable, how, Hermione? She stopped. 5 questions, he said. She took a breath. Reorganized. When she spoke again she had, with visible effort, achieved something approaching calm. Okay. Who built this? My ancestor. A very long time ago. How long? Before Hogwarts. She looked at the hall again, recalculating everything from scratch. What's in the library? Texts that don't exist anywhere else. Some in languages that aren't in any current academic tradition. He watched her face cycle through the implications of this. Some that would change what we think we know about magical history. She looked at him. Are you going to let me read them? That's why you're here. The silence lasted about 1 second. What's the 5th question? She asked. Harry gestured toward the center of the hall, toward Lumen's plinth, where the amber sphere had been pulsing with increasing interest since Hermione's arrival. I'll let him answer the ones I can't. Hermione looked at Lumen. Lumen pulsed gently. Hello, it said. Hermione made a sound Harry had never heard from her before, a short, soft intake of breath that was completely unguarded, the sound of someone encountering something so far outside their existing framework that their usual confidence momentarily had nowhere to stand. Then she squared her shoulders, walked forward, and said, What are you? A constructed intelligence, Lumen said. Built to advise, record, and occasionally argue. You are Hermione Granger. I've been listening to Harry describe you for 2 weeks. Hermione shot Harry a look. He kept his expression neutral. What has he been saying? She asked. That you're the most intellectually rigorous person in his year and that he needs someone who can help process 14,000 texts, many of which require a combination of academic discipline and genuine courage to engage with properly. A warm beat. He was also quite specific about the courage part. He said, and I'm quoting precisely, she corrects professors without flinching, which means she isn't afraid of being wrong about authority. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Harry with an expression that was complicated and new and slightly off balance in a way that suggested she hadn't expected to be assessed as an equal by anyone her age. You've been watching me, she said. I've been evaluating you, Harry said. There's a difference. I wasn't tracking you. I was making a decision about whether I could trust you with something important. And you followed me through a castle in the middle of the night with 2 books and a notebook, without knowing what you'd find, and your first instinct when you found it was to ask how old it was. He paused. So yes. Hermione looked at the library archway. At the shelves in the alcoves. At the crystal-suspended texts glowing softly in Lumen's amber light. Where do I start? She said. She started with the architectural records. Lumen's suggestion, practical, methodical, the kind of starting point that gave context to everything else rather than overwhelming without foundation. The architectural records were among the oldest texts in the outer library that were accessible to someone without Ashvale bloodline, written in an archaic but derivable form of Proto-Runic that Hermione decoded at a speed Lumen privately described to Harry as frankly alarming. She came every other night. Harry had established a rhythm. He went down on the nights between, working through the bloodline records and the deeper memory recovery sessions with Lumen, and Hermione went on the alternating nights, cataloging, indexing, building a systematic map of what the library contained. She brought her notebook system and immediately began designing a new organizational method specifically for material this old and this varied. She had, Harry thought, exactly the right kind of mind for this, not just smart but structured, the intelligence of someone who builds shelves as well as fills them. On their joint nights, Tuesdays and Fridays, they sat at the long dark table with texts between them and worked in a silence that became increasingly comfortable as the weeks passed. She never asked him directly about his past lives. He noticed this and appreciated it. She circled the subject with the respect of someone who understands the difference between information they need and information they want, and prioritizes accordingly. When he did tell her things, pieces of context, fragments of recovered memory that were relevant to the research, she received them without dramatics, incorporated them into her working framework, and asked only the questions that helped her understand the problem better. She was, Harry thought, exactly who he'd needed. And possibly, though he was still sitting with this one, someone he was genuinely glad to know, separate from her usefulness, which was a different and warmer feeling. This notation system, she said one Tuesday, pointing at a margin of a text she'd been working through. On the physical architecture. These marks here, at the base of the column measurements, these aren't decorative, are they? Harry looked. He felt the familiar low current of recognition, the sensation of reading something he'd written in a previous sense of the word. Load distribution indicators. Each mark codes for a specific type of magical stress tolerance. That column, he pointed, was built to absorb the backlash from large-scale castings in the main chamber. The marks tell you how much and from what direction. Hermione looked at him. Looked at the notation. Looked at him again. You just read that as naturally as if it were English. More naturally than English, actually. Harry. She set her quill down. Do you know how many academics have spent their careers trying to decode pre-foundational magical scripts? Bathilda Bagshot spent 40 years on a partial translation of a single text from this period and it's considered a landmark. Bathilda Bagshot's translation of the Caldwell fragment has 17 errors in the first 2 pages, Harry said, not unkindly. Hermione opened her mouth. Closed it. I'm going to need to read that. Second shelf in the east alcove, third from the left. He'd found it last week, noted the errors, moved on. She stared at him. 17 errors. She was working from an incomplete understanding of the grammatical stress system. The script isn't just symbolic, the spacing carries meaning. She collapsed the spacing into a translation convention and lost about 30% of the semantic content. He thought about how to explain this and landed on a metaphor. It's like reading music notation but ignoring the rests. You get the notes but not the rhythm, and without the rhythm, you're reading a different piece. Hermione was quiet for a moment, doing something rapid and internal with this information. If you published a corrected translation, I won't be publishing anything for quite a while, Harry said. Not under my name. But the field, there are people working in magical history right now who are building entirely on Hermione. She stopped. I know, he said. It's frustrating. But we can't draw attention to this yet. When we can, we will. He looked at her steadily. I promise you that everything down here eventually sees light. But we choose the timing, and the timing matters. She held his gaze for a long moment with the expression of someone having a genuine internal argument, and then nodded, once, with the decisive precision of someone who has made the argument, lost it on the merits, and accepted the outcome. Fine, she said. But I want it noted that this is professionally excruciating. Noted, Harry said, and she made a small sound that was almost a laugh, which was something he hadn't heard from her before. The cursed object moved again in late October, and this time Harry was ready. He'd been refining his sensitivity to the probe over the weeks since his conversation with Lumen, not actively reaching toward it, nothing that could be detected as a return signal, just learning its texture, its frequency, the particular quality of inquiry it represented. By mid-October he could distinguish individual sessions of probing, who was operating the object, single operator, consistent magical signature, experienced and precise, when they were active, primarily late night, occasionally early morning, and what sections of the seal architecture they were currently examining. They were working their way inward. Third ring to second, second to first. Patience, methodical, like someone reading a document they've had for a long time but only recently found the key to. They were good. Harry gave them that. He was better. On the night the object shifted to examine the first ring, the preservation ring, the innermost layer before the recognition architecture, Harry was already in the vault. He waited until the probe was fully engaged, fully committed to its current examination, and then he did something small and precise and deeply elegant. He adjusted the resonance of the preservation ring by exactly enough to give a false reading. Not a blocked reading. A slightly wrong one. The kind of wrong that looked like natural decay rather than interference, the kind of wrong that said these seals are weakening in this specific vector when in fact they were entirely stable. The kind of wrong that would redirect any outside examination toward a false point of interest. Lumen watched this happening in silence. You've been planning that for a while, it said, when he was done. 2 weeks. He stepped back from the seal architecture. They'll spend the next month examining the wrong section. That buys us time. It also tells them something. It tells them the seals are failing on the east vector. Which isn't true. But it tells me something more useful. It tells me where they'll concentrate resources, which tells me something about their methodology, which tells me something about their training. He turned to Lumen. How many ancient families had access to first-ring seal architecture at this level? In the current era? Theoretically, any of the old 7 bloodlines could have preserved knowledge of it. Practically, Lumen paused. The Selwyn family maintained a private archive of pre-foundational magical theory that was not destroyed in the purges of 1821. The Peveril descendants, the bloodline is diffuse now but extant, had access to Aldrich's own journals through a bequest that went unrecorded in public history. A longer pause. And there is a group. I became aware of them approximately 60 years ago, through their activity pattern on the seals. They call themselves, when they call themselves anything, the Warden Council. Though their original name, the one Aldrich knew them by, was the sealed seven. Harry was very still. He knew them. They were his allies, Lumen said, quietly. They were the 7 families he trusted most. He left them knowledge, not of the vault, not of the seal's full architecture, but enough to monitor. Enough to know if something was wrong. A beat. Their original mandate was protective. Watch the seals. Report to the bloodline when the bloodline existed. Maintain the knowledge so it wouldn't be lost. Harry looked at the sphere. When did the mandate change? Approximately 300 years ago. At some point in the 17th century the knowledge passed to a generation that asked a different question. Not what are we protecting, but what are we being denied? Lumen's light shifted, dimmer. The thing inside the cradle, what Aldrich sealed, they stopped thinking of it as a wound and started thinking of it as a resource. A power that Aldrich had monopolized in death the same way powerful men monopolize things in life. The light steadied. They're not evil, Harry. I want you to understand that clearly. They're wrong, and they're dangerous, and what they want to do would be catastrophic. But they believe sincerely that they're serving magical humanity. They believe the sealed power belongs to everyone and that Aldrich is, a tyrant who died in a position of control and used that death to maintain it. Harry turned this over carefully. They're not entirely wrong, he said. Lumen paused. No, it said. They're not entirely wrong. That's what makes them worth understanding. Another pause. And considerably more dangerous than if they were simply evil. Quidditch tryouts happened and Harry did not attend them, which caused Ron Weasley visible distress. Ron had discovered approximately 2 weeks in that Harry had a natural aptitude for flying, or rather, had watched Harry handle a broom with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who has done it thousands of times in a body that once had the same bone structure, and had been on a quiet campaign since then to get Harry onto the Gryffindor team. You could make Seeker easy, Ron said at breakfast, watching the Gryffindor Quidditch captain, Oliver Wood, cross the hall with a clipboard. You fly like you've been doing it your whole life. I have, Harry said, which was true in a more literal sense than Ron understood. First years don't usually get on the house team. I know. So you should try out. Harry put down his fork. Ron. Tell me what I actually want to do with my time at Hogwarts. Ron blinked. Quidditch? No. Oh. A pause. Studying. Among other things. Ron absorbed this with the careful expression of someone who is trying to be supportive of a position they genuinely don't understand. He was, Harry had decided, one of the most instinctively good-natured people he'd met, loyal without strategy, kind in the uncalculated way that came from genuine disposition rather than social management. He was also not academically driven and thought Hermione was somewhat alarming, which was not unique to him but which he at least expressed honestly rather than resentfully. You could do both, Ron offered. I probably will, eventually, Harry said. Just not this year. He watched Wood tick something on his clipboard. Tell me about Voldemort. Ron went white so abruptly it was almost impressive. His goblet tipped slightly. Don't, you shouldn't say, the name. Harry looked at him. It's a name, Ron. Saying it doesn't do anything. My mum says, I know what people say. Harry was patient about this, genuinely patient. He understood the fear architecture around the name, the deliberate cultivation of it, the way terror calcified around a specific syllable until the syllable itself became a ward of sorts, a social signal that separated people who had made peace with fear from people who were still inside it. I'm asking because I want to know what you know. Personal experience. Your family was in it during the war. Ron swallowed. Yeah. He looked at his plate. Lost some people. Friends of Mum and Dad. My mum's brothers, 2 of them. My dad lost his, he doesn't really talk about it. His jaw worked. I was a baby. But I grew up with it. The way people talked about it. Like even afterward, even when he was gone, the conversation had a shape it couldn't get out of. Harry listened to this carefully, to the shape of the grief underneath the words, the third-generation trauma that wasn't even really third generation because Voldemort had not, as everyone knew, been fully defeated. Was still out there, formless, diminished, waiting. "He's coming back," Harry said. Ron looked at him. "Everyone says he's gone." "He's not gone." Harry said it quietly, without drama, the way you say a thing that is simply true. "He's diminished. But he's coming back. Probably sooner than people want to think." He looked at Ron steadily. "When that happens, the way you know what to do is by understanding what you're actually dealing with. Not the fear. The thing underneath the fear." Ron was very quiet. "Which is what?" he said. "A man," Harry said. "A very powerful, very damaged man who made choices that I think he's no longer capable of fully understanding the impact of. That doesn't make him less dangerous. It makes him more predictable." Ron stared at him for a long moment. "How do you know all this?" "You grew up with Muggles." Harry smiled. "I had a lot of time to think in a very small cupboard." That landed as a joke, and Ron smiled, uncertain, and Harry let it be a joke because it was also, in its way, the most accurate thing he could have said. November arrived with cold and rain and the particular collective misery of a castle full of students discovering for the first time how much work advanced magical education actually involved. The library filled up. The common room filled up. Neville discovered he had an exceptional aptitude for herbology, and the discovery visibly reorganized something in the way he held himself, not dramatically, not overnight, but Harry watched it happen over 2 weeks, the specific quality of Neville's slump shifting degree by degree towards something that still had reservations about the world but had one fewer reservation about itself. Harry had started joining Neville in the greenhouses after dinner when his schedule allowed. Not because he had particular things to discuss, though conversation happened naturally, but because Neville functioned differently there, more direct, less careful about performing, less occupied with preempting criticism. He was good with plants in the way that Harry was starting to realize was fairly unusual, not just technically skilled but genuinely attentive in a way that plants, apparently, responded to. "You talk to them," Harry said one evening, watching Neville coax a sulking devil's snare cutting with a low, steady murmur. "Not really talking," Neville said, not embarrassed. "More like, paying the right kind of attention. I don't know how to explain it. You have to be calm and consistent, because they respond to you. If you're stressed they get difficult. If you're patient he paused, they trust you, sort of. Which is a weird word for a plant." "It's the right word," Harry said. Neville looked at him sideways. "You know a lot about plants." "A little. Some of what was in the vault." The magical agriculture section of the library was substantial. Aldrich had been interested in growing things, in the way that people who spend a lot of time working with fundamental forces develop interests in fundamental things. "More than I used to." Neville looked like he wanted to ask about that and decided not to, which was a quality Harry had been appreciating in him since their first conversation in the entrance hall. He never pushed. He received what was offered and waited for more in the comfortable way of someone who isn't in a hurry to complete you. "My Gran thinks I should drop herbology for an extra study session," Neville said. "She thinks it's not academic enough. Magical botany is older than most of what's taught in this castle." Neville looked at him. "The relationship between magical plants and ambient magical fields is more complex than any standard curriculum covers," Harry said. "If you understand it properly, you understand something fundamental about the way magic propagates through living systems. Which has implications for healing magic, for curse work, for climate." He stopped himself. "The point is, your Gran is wrong, and you don't have to drop it." Neville turned back to the devil's snare cutting, which had relaxed noticeably in the last 3 minutes. "You know," he said quietly, "you're the first person who's told me my Gran is wrong about something and it doesn't feel like they're just saying it to be nice." Harry looked at him. "I'm not saying it to be nice. I know." Neville smiled, small and honest. That's why it helps. The night Hermione found the codex was a Friday in mid-November, and Harry knew something significant had happened before she even spoke because of the quality of her silence when he arrived. She was standing at the table with a text open before her, not one from the shelves, but one from the deep archive, the crystal-preserved section that she'd only recently gained access to, and she was very still, both hands flat on the table beside it, reading in the particular focused way that meant she'd been reading the same passage repeatedly. Harry set his bag down. "What did you find?" She looked up. She had the expression he'd seen once before, during their first night down here, the expression of someone whose framework has just been structurally altered. "The Codex of Primary Constants," she said. "Do you know it?" Harry looked at the text. He felt the recognition move through him slow and certain. "The foundational document," he said. "The theoretical basis for everything that became modern magical practice." He paused. "What's wrong with it?" "It has a chapter," Hermione said carefully, "that doesn't exist in any published version. Or any version I've ever heard of. The published codex has 14 chapters. This one has 15. She turned the crystal case so he could see more clearly. Chapter 8a, inserted between chapters 8 and 9. The script is the same as the rest of the document, same hand, same ink, same apparent age. It wasn't added later. It was removed from every other version. Harry sat down. "What does it say?" Hermione took a breath. "It's a description," she said. "Of what's in the cradle." The hall was very quiet. Lumen's light went, very briefly, intensely bright. Then steadied. "Read it to me," Harry said. She looked at him. "Are you sure?" "Because I've read the first 3 paragraphs in it," she paused, "it doesn't say what they think it is. The Warden Council, or whatever they're calling themselves, if they're trying to get to it because they think it's a usable power source, they're wrong." She looked at the page. "They're dangerously, catastrophically wrong." "What is it?" Harry asked. Hermione placed one finger at the top of the hidden chapter, and read. "And in the amber light of the vault, while the castle above slept and the seals hummed their patient resistance 60 feet below the dreams of the students those seals were protecting, the knowledge of what had been sacrificed and what had been saved and what would happen if someone undid that sacrifice moved from the ancient page into the present moment like a stone dropped into still water, slow, inevitable, the ripples already beginning." Harry listened to every word. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long time. "Lumen," Harry said finally. "Yes," Lumen said, quietly. "Why didn't you tell me this directly?" A pause that was not evasion but something more careful. "Because the Codex says it better than I could, and because I needed you to hear it from a source that wasn't me. A source you and she could verify independently." Another pause. "I'm an advisor, Harry. I can lead you to the information. How you receive it, how you sit with it, that's yours." Harry looked at the page. Then at Hermione, who was watching him with the careful attention of someone trying to read whether the weight of something is too much. It wasn't too much. It was large, and it was serious, and it changed the shape of everything ahead of him. But it wasn't too much. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Hermione said. "We know what it is now. That's better than not knowing." He looked at the crystal case, at the missing chapter that someone had worked very hard to make missing. "Which means the next question is who removed it from the published versions, and when, and whether the Warden Council knows it's here." Hermione was quiet for a moment. "If they knew, they'd have come for it. So they don't know." Harry looked at the archway leading deeper into the vault, the direction of the cradle, the direction of the sealed thing, the wound and reality that he had died to close and would spend this life maintaining. "Which means we have a window." "A window for what?" Harry looked at her. "For understanding this completely, before they do." He stood, Began collecting the texts that needed to go back to their shelves, moving with the economical purpose of someone who has decided that enough time has been spent sitting with information and it is time to start doing things with it. We need to map every access point to the cradle from above. Every person in this castle with the knowledge base to operate the cursed object. Every text in this library that relates to the primary constants. He paused. And we need to figure out what Dumbledore is keeping on the third floor, because it's not just a locked door. Hermione watched him for a moment with an expression that was calculating and slightly unnerved and, underneath both of those things, unmistakably energized. You already know what's on the third floor. I have a strong suspicion. Which is? Something he moved there deliberately, probably recently, possibly because he's responding to the same probe readings we are. He knows something is happening in this castle. He doesn't know what. And he's, in his way, doing something about it. Harry looked at her. He's not our enemy. But he's operating on incomplete information and he's protective enough of his position as the person with the most information to be a problem if we let him manage the situation. Hermione absorbed this with the systematic efficiency she brought to everything. So what do we do? Harry picked up his bag. Read faster, he said, and walked toward the stairs. Behind him, Hermione looked at Lumen. Is he always like this? She asked. He used to be worse, Lumen said cheerfully. He once stared at a geopolitical crisis for 6 months and then resolved it in a weekend. Consider yourself lucky. Hermione looked at the library archway, at the 14,000 texts that suddenly felt like both an enormous amount and not quite enough. Then she picked up her notebook and her quill and began a new page with the heading, Priority Research List, Revised. She had 12 entries by the time Harry's footsteps faded up the stairs. Chapter 3, The Potter named the letter from Gringotts arrived on a Wednesday. Harry was at breakfast when it came, carried not by one of the school owls but by something that was technically an owl in the same way a cathedral is technically a building, black-feathered, enormous, wearing a Gringotts seal on its leg band like a badge of office. It dropped the letter directly in front of Harry's plate with the precise contempt of a creature that delivers correspondence to kings and finds the whole business slightly beneath it, and then sat on the edge of the table and waited. The Gryffindor table went quiet in the radius around Harry. Ron looked at the owl. The owl looked at Ron in a way that made Ron stop looking at the owl. Harry broke the seal. The letter was written in the angular goblin script he could read as naturally as English, had been able to since his first week, another thing that had arrived without announcement. One morning he'd looked at a Gringotts document he'd found in the outer library and simply read it, the way you suddenly understand something you've been working toward. The content of the letter was precise and formal and carried the particular weight of institutions that have been operating longer than most governments and have no patience for ambiguity. Mr. H. J. Potter, head of the ancient and most noble house of Potter, this office writes to inform you that the Potter family vault, dormant these 11 years, has registered your accession to majority status under the provisions of the Ashvale Bloodline Charter of 832 CE. Under the terms of this charter, the head of the Potter line is entitled to a full account review, the reclamation of any seized or otherwise displaced assets, and the formal restoration of the Potter family seat on the Wisengamot. This office further notes that 17 outstanding claims against the Potter estate, filed between 1982 and 1991, have been suspended pending your review. Several of these claims originate from parties who will be displeased by your accession. We recommend you visit at your earliest convenience. Ragnarok, Senior Account Manager, Gringotts Wizarding Bank, London. Harry folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and finished his porridge. Ron, who had been watching with escalating curiosity and a heroic effort at patience, lasted about 45 more seconds. What was that? Banking correspondence, Harry said. From Gringotts? That's where most banking correspondence comes from, yes. Ron's mouth opened and closed. Harry, that owl, needs to go back, Harry said, and looked at the black owl, which had continued to stare at the Gryffindor table with the patient disdain of something that had other appointments. Tell Ragnarok I'll be there Saturday. The owl held eye contact with Harry for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Then it spread its wings, knocked over Seamus's pumpkin juice with one wingtip, possibly deliberately, and was gone. Hermione caught Harry's eye from 3 seats down. He met her gaze briefly and looked back at his breakfast. She understood immediately and turned back to her own plate with the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned when not to react. He told her that night. They were in the vault, the usual Friday session, Hermione cataloging a section of the mechanical texts while Harry worked through the second-tier bloodline records with Lumen. The forge was behind them, cold and patient, and the map in the floor gleamed in the amber light. Harry read out the letter from memory. He hadn't brought it, but he didn't need to. When he finished, Hermione set her quill down. "The Ashvale Bloodline Charter," she said. "Of 832 CE. Yes. That predates the Hogwarts founding by nearly 3 decades. Yes." She was doing the thing she did when information reorganized her framework, the brief stillness, the rapid internal recalculation, the visible moment of arrival at a new position. It's a legal document. Filed with Gringotts. Which means it's been active for over 1,000 years and goblins have known about the Potter-Ashvale connection this whole time. Goblins don't share information they're not asked for, Lumen said from its plinth. And no one has thought to ask in about 3 centuries. What does the family seat on the Wisengamot mean? Hermione asked. Practically speaking. Voting rights, Harry said. Political standing. Formal recognition of house status. He looked at the letter in his memory. The 17 outstanding claims are more interesting. Someone has been trying to pick apart the Potter estate since 1982. 1 year after my parents died. While you were in no position to object, Hermione said. While I was in no position to object, Harry confirmed. Who filed them? The letter doesn't say. But the charter specifies that claims against the estate are suspended upon the heir's accession to majority status, and apparently that triggered automatically when I arrived at Hogwarts and the Bloodline Charter recognized the alert from the vault. He looked at Lumen. Did you trigger that? Passively, Lumen said. The Charter's recognition protocol is tied to the recognition ring. When you passed through and it registered your blood, it sent a confirmation to Gringotts. Standard procedure under the 832 document. I didn't do it actively. It was always going to happen. Hermione had pulled out her notebook. What else does the charter entitle you to? Full account access. Historical records. Asset reclamation, which could be considerable given that the Potters have been a significant family for a very long time and property has been, let's say redistributed, since 1981. Harry paused. And the family library. Hermione's quill stopped moving. The Potter family library, Harry said, is a separate collection from this one. Public-facing, comparatively, the kind of thing that would have been accessible to scholars under the right conditions. James Potter's branch of the family maintained it in a property in Wales. According to the vault records, that property was seized under ministerial authority in 1984 on grounds of abandonment. He looked at Hermione steadily. With my accession, the seizure is invalid. The property and its contents revert. Hermione was staring at him with an expression that was 2 parts academic hunger and 1 part something that might have been concern. Harry, reclaiming the family seat and disputing ministerial seizures, that's going to get attention. Yes, Harry said. Dumbledore is going to want to talk to you. He's wanted to talk to me since September, Harry said. I've been busy. Hermione looked at him. You've been avoiding him. I've been not seeking him out, Harry said. There's a difference. Is there? Harry looked at her for a moment. He's protecting me from something, he said. I can feel it in the way he looks at me, there's a pattern to the observation, something surveillance adjacent. He's been waiting for something to show up in me, some indicator of a threat or a danger, and he's been watching to manage it. He paused. I don't resent him for it. He's genuinely trying to protect people. But he's operating on incomplete information, the same as the Warden Council, and his response to things he doesn't fully understand is to contain them. He looked back at his work. I'm not going to be contained. So the conversation needs to happen when I have enough standing to have it on equal terms rather than on his. Hermione absorbed this. And the Gringotts visit gives you that standing. It begins to. She looked at her notebook. Made 3 entries. I'm coming to Gringotts. Harry looked up. You'll need someone with you who can process documents quickly and ask the right secondary questions, she said, with the tone of someone making a practical observation rather than requesting permission. And I want to see the property in Wales. Hermione, I know it's yours. I'm not asking to take anything. I'm asking to help you understand what you have. She met his eyes. That's what I'm here for, isn't it? Harry looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Saturday. McGonagall caught him the next morning. Not ambushed, nothing so inelegant. She simply appeared at the end of a corridor as Harry was making his way to Transfiguration, fell into step beside him with the unhurried precision that characterized everything she did, and said, without preamble, Mr. Potter. The headmaster would like a word. Harry kept walking. When? This evening. After supper. I have prior commitments this evening. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for students who were being technically compliant while missing the point. Mr. Potter. Professor, Harry said, pleasantly. Is it urgent? Has something happened that requires my immediate attention? A pause. Not urgent in that sense. Then I'll make time next week. Thursday, if he's available. McGonagall was quiet for 3 steps. Harry was familiar, by now, with her particular silences. She had several, and this one was the version that meant she was reconsidering her approach. He's going to ask you about the Gringotts owl, she said. I assumed he might. He's concerned about the financial and legal implications of, she stopped herself, reorganized. He feels it would be appropriate to discuss these matters with someone who can advise you. I have advisors, Harry said, and she looked at him with an expression that briefly crossed into surprise before settling back into composed. Thank you, Professor. Thursday, please let him know. He turned into the Transfiguration classroom. McGonagall stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the space where he'd been. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction, and her expression, if anyone had been in the corridor to observe it, would have been difficult to categorize, somewhere between amused and something that was trying quite hard not to be concerned. Gringotts on a Saturday morning was exactly as Harry expected, intimidating in the institutional way of places that have been powerful for a very long time and see no reason to perform humility. The hall was busy, goblins processing transactions at the long counters with the brisk efficiency of a species that treats money as a kind of language and is considerably more fluent in it than humans. Hermione stood beside Harry and looked at everything simultaneously, which was impressive given that there was quite a lot to look at. Ragnarok was not a small goblin. Most of the goblins at the public counters were compact, efficient presences. Ragnarok was something different, older, heavier, with the quality of something that has been in the same place for so long it has become part of the architecture. He met them at a private door off the main hall, looked at Harry once, and then bowed, formally, with a precision that made several nearby goblins and at least 2 humans stop what they were doing. Head of the House of Potter, he said. This account has awaited your majority for 11 years. Thank you for maintaining it, Harry said, which was the right thing to say. Hermione had read the relevant section of goblin etiquette and relations and briefed him on the train, and Ragnarok's expression shifted by approximately 1 millimeter in a way that indicated he was pleased and had not entirely expected to be. The account review took 2 hours. Harry sat in a private chamber that smelled of old stone and metal and something faintly alchemical, and Ragnarok laid out the Potter estate in systematic detail, and Harry listened to every word with the complete attention he reserved for things that would require action. Hermione sat beside him with her notebook and wrote faster than Harry thought humanly possible, creating a parallel record, flagging questions, occasionally asking Ragnarok to pause so she could verify a figure. The estate was substantial. Not obscenely wealthy in the way some old families were, the Potters had not been primarily an accumulating line. They'd been a maintaining line. The wealth was in property, in artifacts, in legal rights and holdings that had been tied up in the estate since the 800s and had been accreting quietly for the last millennium like geological layers. Several properties. One quite large one in Wales that the ministry had seized and which Ragnarok was already drafting the reclamation paperwork for with the particular relish of a goblin who enjoys proving ministry overreach invalid. And then the artifacts. The Potter family vault contains, Ragnarok said, placing a document on the table, in addition to standard monetary holdings, approximately 400 discrete magical artifacts. Of these, 63 have been flagged under the ministry's dangerous objects register. This office disputes those flaggings as politically motivated. Show me the 63, Harry said. Ragnarok produced a secondary list. Harry read it. He felt the recognition current moving through him, warm and precise. Not all of these were his former work, but some were, passed down through the Ashville Potter lineage, maintained and stored and waiting. Items of genuine power, categorized as dangerous because they were old and poorly understood, not because they were harmful. The ministry wants to retain custody of these items, he said. The ministry would prefer that, yes. Harry slid the document back across the table. Dispute every flagging. Full legal challenge. I'll want the grounds for each flagging in writing. He paused. What's the timeline? With the bloodline charter as precedent, and given that the flaggings were made without the consent of the estate's rightful heir, 3 months, perhaps less. Goblin contract law supersedes ministry administrative ordinance in matters of established charter. Hermione had stopped writing and was looking at Ragnarok with the expression of someone who has just found a fascinating legal framework they hadn't known existed. One more thing, Harry said. The 17 outstanding claims against the estate. I want to know who filed them. Ragnarok folded his hands on the table. Several of the filings were anonymous by design. 3 are directly traceable, one from the Ministry Aura Division, requesting access to Potter property for investigative purposes. One from Albus Dumbledore, acting in his capacity as executor of the Potter estate. Harry's eyes didn't move. And the third? Filed under the name of a legal proxy. Ragnarok held his gaze. The proxy name is a shell, we are fairly certain it originates with a consortium of older families. The documentation they use to establish proxy standing is exceptional in quality but contains an error in the 1847 modification of the Bloodline Charter that only someone unfamiliar with the Goblin original would make. He paused. Someone with access to very old knowledge. But not quite old enough. Harry looked at Hermione briefly. She wrote something in her notebook without looking up. Keep monitoring that filing, Harry said. I want to know if they make any new moves. Of course. Ragnarok rose. There is one additional matter. A deposit was made to the Potter Vault in October of 1981. 1 week before, he paused with the delicacy of a creature that understands loss, before the events in Godric's Hollow. He produced a small sealed envelope. It was left with instructions that it be delivered to the heir upon accession. We've been holding it for 11 years. Harry took the envelope. His parents' wax seal, a stylized P over a lightning bolt that predated the scar on his forehead. He turned it over once. Thank you, Ragnarok, he said. The goblin bowed again, that same precise formal bow. The House of Potter is restored, head of house. We are honored to serve the old accounts. They read the letter in a small cafe in Diagon Alley that Hermione had identified as quiet and private and unlikely to be frequented by anyone from the wizarding world who would recognize them. Harry's father's handwriting was compact and slightly impatient, the handwriting of someone who thinks faster than they write. His mother's was in the margins, annotations, corrections, additions that were sometimes longer than the original text, the handwriting of someone who is collaborating rather than agreeing. Harry read it without speaking, and then read it again. He set it down on the table between them. Hermione looked at him carefully, the particular quality of attention she used when she was assessing emotional rather than intellectual information. He'd become aware of this over the past weeks, the way she had two modes of looking, and could switch between them with more precision than most people managed. "What does it say?" she asked, gently. Harry looked at the letter. His father had written it quickly, in the voice of someone who doesn't have much time and knows it. A summary, a record, really. Addressed not to Harry by name but to our child, they hadn't known, Harry thought, at that point. Or they hadn't committed. James had known something was wrong with the Potter bloodline's gap in history. He'd found fragments, not vault level, not the full picture, but enough to know that there was something important he hadn't been told, some responsibility that should have been passed to him that had been lost with his father's early death. He'd been trying to research it. He'd gotten far enough to understand that something in the Potter line was old and important and that Harry, our child, would need to know, would need to find it, would need to understand things that James himself hadn't understood. He'd left the vault deposit as a breadcrumb. If you're reading this, you found Gringotts, which means you know enough to start. Look deeper than the history books. The Potters were never just a family. We were a function. His mother's addition was in the margin at the bottom. Her handwriting was faster than his father's, more angular, and Harry felt it in his chest differently, a different kind of loss, something she'd written in the last seconds of available time. We love you more than the work. Remember that. The work matters enormously. But you matter more. Don't be Eldrick. Be Harry. Whatever that means when you find it, be that. Harry folded the letter. Hermione was very quiet. She knew, Harry said. Your mother. She knew what I was. She was Muggle-born, no family tradition, no ancestral frame for it. But she researched everything, Lumen said. She found fragments of the Ashvale history that James never found. She understood what she'd married into. He looked at the letter. She left the annotation deliberately. She knew I'd need permission to be different from what I came from. Hermione was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Something open and careful and, underneath it, its own kind of grief, the grief of someone who understands the shape of being loved intelligently, which is a specific and particular thing. She was right, Hermione said. About being Harry instead of Eldrick. I know. He put the letter in his pocket. I already knew that. But it's different, hearing it from her. Hermione nodded, and didn't push, and drank her tea, and after a minute she said, the Wales property, Ragnarok said we can see it next weekend, once the reclamation paperwork processes. Yes, Harry said. And the Dumbledore meeting is Thursday. Yes. Are you ready for that? Harry looked out the window at Diagon Alley, the busy Saturday morning crowd, witches and wizards going about their December lives, the ordinary surface of a world that had no idea what was failing in the bedrock below its most famous school. I've been ready for it for 2 months, he said. Dumbledore's office was full of things. Harry had known it would be. He'd heard enough about the headmaster from enough angles, portraits, ghosts, the general ambient mythology of the castle, to know that the office was a kind of extension of the man, accumulating instruments and curiosities the way Dumbledore accumulated information. He just hadn't anticipated how immediately obvious it would be that most of the instruments were monitoring something. He stood in the center of the circular room while Dumbledore descended from where he'd been examining something at a high shelf, and Harry looked at the spinning, clicking, measuring devices on their spindle legs with the calm assessment of someone reading a room. 3 of them were pointed at him before he'd been in the space for 30 seconds. He let them look. Harry, Dumbledore said, warm, settling into the chair behind the enormous desk. Please sit down. Lemon drop? No thank you, Harry said, and sat, and looked at Dumbledore with the direct, unhurried attention that was simply his natural mode and which, he had noticed, tended to make people adjust their posture slightly. Dumbledore looked back. His blue eyes were, as advertised, very bright and very clever, and they moved over Harry with an assessment that was considerably more detailed than the expression around them suggested. He was, Harry thought, genuinely exceptional, the kind of mind that had been working at full capacity for a very long time and had developed the patience that came with sustained excellence. He was also, and Harry say this clearly, looking at him the way you look at a chessboard when a piece has moved somewhere you didn't expect. "I understand you've been to Gringotts," Dumbledore said. "Yes." Harry looked at the instruments. "3 of those are monitoring my magical signature. The one on the far left is measuring something else, ambient levels, I think." "What is it looking for?" Dumbledore paused. A very small pause, well controlled, but there. "You're perceptive," he said. "You're monitoring me," Harry said, still pleasant. "I'm not offended. I understand why. But I'd rather we were honest about it." Dumbledore set down his lemon drop. He looked at Harry for a moment with a new quality of attention, the assessment recalibrating. "The instrument on the left measures fluctuations in the castle's foundational magical field," he said, which was true and also considerably less than the full truth. "And you've been watching it since term began," Harry said. "Because you felt something shift in the foundational field. Something below the normal parameters." Dumbledore was very still. "The seals," Harry said, keeping his voice level and matter of fact, the way you keep your voice when you are informing someone of something rather than confronting them. "Below the castle. You know they exist. You've known for a long time, probably since you became headmaster, possibly since you were a student. You don't know exactly what they are or who made them, but you know the castle sits on something very old and that the something very old is currently behaving differently than it has for the past decade." The office was very quiet. Fawkes, on his perch, made a low sound. "You are," Dumbledore said, carefully, "quite extraordinary for a first-year student." "I'm quite extraordinary for a person of any age," Harry said, without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact. "You were going to figure that out anyway." "I'd prefer to save time." He looked at the headmaster steadily. "You filed a claim against my family's estate in 1982. I'd like to understand why." Something moved behind Dumbledore's eyes, not guilt, exactly, but the recognition of a man who has made choices he considers justified and is now having those choices examined by someone he can't quite place at the right disadvantage. "I was your parents' executor," he said. "The filing was designed to protect the estate from parties who were making more aggressive claims immediately after they died," Harry said. "Yes. Is that the complete explanation?" A pause. Dumbledore looked at his hands, then back at Harry. The bright eyes had, for the first time since Harry entered the room, lost some of their managed composure. "I believed," he said, "that the estate contained things that required careful stewardship. Items and information that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Including mine." "You were a year old, Harry." "I'm not a year old now." Harry let that sit for a moment. "I have no intention of using anything in my family's estate irresponsibly. I have no intention of doing anything irresponsible, as a general principle. What I do intend is to understand fully what my family was and what I've inherited, and to make my own decisions about what to do with that understanding." He paused. "I'm telling you this directly rather than simply proceeding without your knowledge because I think you deserve the information, and because you're the head of this school and that means we're going to need a working relationship." Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. Harry almost smiled. Malfoy had said the same thing, 2 months ago, in a corridor outside a locked door. "No one says that to me and means it simply," Harry said. "What did you expect?" Dumbledore seemed to weigh something. Then, with the decision-making visible in his expression for just a moment before he recomposed it, a child still coming into himself. Someone who would need guidance and time and the kind of careful, scaffolding, you might say, that allows a young person to grow into unusual capability without being overwhelmed by it. And instead, Dumbledore said, I find someone who is already oriented. Who knows, Or is discovering the direction they need to move, and is moving in it with a certainty I've rarely seen in anyone, let alone someone your age. He picked up his lemon drop again, turned it between his fingers. I find it both remarkable and, I'll be honest, somewhat concerning. Concerning why? Harry asked. Because certainty without full understanding can be as dangerous as ignorance. I agree, Harry said. Which is why I'm spending a great deal of time pursuing full understanding before I act on anything. He met Dumbledore's eyes. I'm not certain about everything. I'm certain about the direction. Those are different things. Dumbledore was quiet. There are people, Harry said, shifting the conversation with the same unhurried confidence, probing the foundational structure of this castle. From inside it. Using a cursed object planted in the third-floor corridor. He watched Dumbledore's face very carefully. You know about the object. I put additional wards on that corridor as a precaution. Yes. What you may not know is that the object is not simply dangerous in itself. It's directional. It's sending information outward, to a group of people who are trying to understand, and eventually access, something below this castle that cannot be accessed without catastrophic consequences. He paused. I need you to remove the object. Not just ward around it. Remove it. Dumbledore looked at him. What are you not telling me, Harry? Quite a lot, Harry said, honestly. But what I've just told you is the part you need to act on, and I promise you the rest will become clear in time. Can you trust that? Can you trust me? Dumbledore replied, and it wasn't a deflection, it was a genuine question, offered with something that was close to vulnerability, the question of a man who is used to being the one who decides what trust means and is finding himself on the other side of that equation. Harry looked at him. I trust your intentions, he said, carefully. I'm still evaluating your judgment. He stood. That's honest. You deserve honest. Dumbledore looked at him from behind the desk, the instrument on the left spinning quietly, monitoring foundations, and his expression was something Harry didn't have a complete word for yet. Something between admiration and the particular unease of a man who has spent many years being the most far-sighted person in any room and is now not entirely certain that's still true. Thursday was your suggestion for this meeting, Dumbledore said. Yes. Why Thursday specifically? Harry looked at the headmaster. Because I needed to visit Gringotts first. He picked up his bag. Good night, Professor. He left the office. On the stairs, Dumbledore's monitoring instrument, the foundational one, the one watching the seals, clicked once, sharply, and was quiet. December arrived. The castle wound down toward the holidays with the particular atmospheric pressure of a place that was holding approximately 400 people's anticipation and had been doing so for 3 months and was ready for a rest. Students practiced switching spells with decreasing accuracy and increasing desperation. The library filled up. Peeves began his seasonal campaign of targeted chaos with a creativity that Harry grudgingly admired. Harry studied. He was, his teachers were discovering, a genuinely excellent student, not in the performing for grades way that Hermione was excellent, but in the deeply interested, goes 3 levels deeper than asked and then asks again way that is simultaneously a teacher's delight and occasionally their anxiety. Professor Flitwick had, after Harry's second charms essay came back with footnotes that contained counter-arguments to Flitwick's own published work from 1967, started watching him with an expression that was 1 part delight and 2 parts intrigued bewilderment. McGonagall had given him the Transfiguration essay equivalent of a standing ovation and then, when his follow-up questions revealed he'd independently derived a modification to the standard partial transformation technique that reduced magical expenditure by about 1/3, quietly requested he come to her office and repeat the derivation so she could examine his reasoning. She hadn't given him a grade on that one. She'd given him a look. Snape was a problem in the opposite direction, and Harry dealt with it by being correct about absolutely everything in potions without providing Snape any obvious leverage, which was its own kind of frustration for a professor who relied on student inadequacy as a management tool. Harry followed every instruction to the letter, produced the best potions in the class with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands the chemistry rather than just following a recipe, and answered questions with the polite concision of someone who finds the material genuinely interesting and has no investment whatsoever in whether the professor likes him. Snape found this deeply unsettling. Harry found this, privately, somewhat amusing. Neville found potions terrifying, which was fair, because Snape was specifically cruel in a way that had nothing to do with Neville's actual performance and everything to do with his name, his father, and whatever weight Snape carried around both. Harry began sitting near Neville and intervening, not loudly, not confrontationally, just with the quiet precision of someone who can redirect a situation before it escalates. When Snape turned his sharpest attention on Neville, Harry would ask a question. The kind of genuinely interesting question that Snape couldn't resist engaging with because for all his cruelties Snape was brilliant at potions and brilliant people can't entirely resist good questions about their subject. It worked. Not always, but often enough. And Neville, who was improving steadily once he stopped bracing for impact before every class, began to breathe differently in the potions corridor. The last week before the holidays, Harry went deeper into the vault than he ever had. Not to the cradle, that was further still, and not yet. But deeper than the library, deeper than the forge, through an archway in the back of the main hall that he'd been aware of since the beginning and approaching gradually, in the way you approach something significant that you want to be properly ready for. The chamber behind it was smaller than he'd expected, and exactly what it needed to be. A workroom. Not a forge, that was for large-scale construction. This was precision work, instrument scale, the kind of space where the maker of extremely fine and particular things would sit for hours at a time in the silence of total concentration. A single chair. A single table, smaller than the one in the main hall, its surface inlaid with the same conductive material as the floor map but in a different configuration, a working surface, designed to assist rather than display. Drawers along the wall, sealed with recognition locks. A rack of tools whose design Harry recognized in his hands before his mind caught up, the way you recognize the grip of something familiar before you see what it is. And on the table, waiting exactly where he'd left it. His wand. Not the Hollyan Phoenix Feather wand. That was a fine instrument and it served him well and it was not his, not in this sense. It was not a wand in the conventional sense, or it was a wand in a sense that conventional had never caught up to. It was made from something that had no modern English name, a material that registered as wood but behaved as something between wood and stone and water, carved and set with 6 aligned stones in a configuration along the handle that were not gems but crystallized magical resonance, the physical form of specific intentions made solid. It was the length of his forearm. It was, Harry realized as he picked it up, precisely calibrated to his former self-specifications, and his current hands fit it with an accuracy that went beyond coincidence. It had been waiting for him to be ready for it. The holly wand had been getting him there. He held it for a long time in the silence of the workroom, feeling the resonance between the instrument and his blood, not dramatic, no surge of power, no cinematic moment. Just the quiet, deep rightness of proper alignment, the feeling of a sentence completing itself. Lumen's voice came through, soft, from the sphere he'd moved into the archway so they could speak during these sessions. "There it is," Lumen said. Harry turned it once in his hand. "Not yet," he said. "I'm not ready for what it can do yet. But I wanted to see it." "Wise," Lumen said. Harry set it back on the table. He went back to the main hall, picked up his bag, and climbed the stairs toward the castle above. Behind him, in the workroom, the wand rested on the table in the amber glow that filtered through from the hall, waiting with the patience of something that has all the time in the world and has already decided who it's waiting for. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on Hogwarts, covering the grounds in the impartial silence of winter. Below the stone, the seals held. The cradle was quiet. The false reading Harry had planted in the east vector was keeping the Warden Council occupied in precisely the wrong direction. Not forever. But long enough. He had work to do. Chapter 4, Fires and Foundations. The Triwizard Tournament announcement hit Hogwarts like weather. Not gradually, not with warning, One morning in early September of Harry's 4th year, Dumbledore stood at the head table during breakfast and spoke, and the hall became the kind of loud that sounds like a single organism rather than 400 separate people. Hermione's quill stopped moving mid-sentence. Ron half stood without apparently deciding to. Even the Slytherin table, which had been maintaining a careful performance of disinterest in everything since the start of term, broke character for a full 30 seconds. Harry ate his toast. He'd known it was coming. Lumen had extensive records on the tournament's previous iterations, the last one in 1792, the one before that in 1683, the long gap before that, and the pattern of timing and circumstance had been pointing toward another iteration for 2 years. He'd mentioned it to Hermione in their 3rd year and she'd spent a month building a research framework around the history of it, which meant she was now simultaneously more excited and more alarmed than anyone else in the hall. She turned to him with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has just been confirmed. "You knew." "I suspected." "Since 3rd year." "Since 3rd year," he agreed. Ron leaned across the table. "Harry, the tournament, they're lifting the age restriction," Dumbledore just said, "I heard. You could enter." "I'm aware. You'd win easily." Harry looked at Ron. "I know." Ron stared at him. "So you're going to enter?" Harry looked at the high table, where Dumbledore was fielding a cascade of questions from the student body with the careful management of someone who has released a controlled substance into a crowded room. "I'm going to think about it," he said, which was a sentence that meant something much more specific in Harry's vocabulary than it meant in most people's. What he was actually thinking about was the cursed object. It had been moved twice more since he'd planted the false reading in the east vector, subtle adjustments, the Warden Council refining their examination of an anomaly that didn't exist. The false reading was holding, but it was also making them work harder, which meant they were getting better at the probe work, which meant the window Harry had been operating in was narrowing. The tournament arriving now, at this moment, was either coincidence or an orchestration, and Harry had spent 3 years developing a strong professional skepticism toward coincidence. He needed to be visible in the tournament. Not for glory, he genuinely did not care about the Triwizard Cup or the prize money or the recognition. But the tournament would bring people from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang into this castle, and the Warden Council's proxy filing had involved documentation quality that suggested European magical tradition, and having hundreds of additional eyes on Hogwarts during a period when the seals were under active examination was not something he could ignore. "I'll enter," he said, 3 days later, to Hermione. She looked up from the codex notation she'd been working on. They were in the vault. 4th year had brought a more detailed understanding of the primary library, and Hermione had by this point catalogued approximately 6,000 texts and was moving through the next section with the focused momentum of someone who has found their life's work. "I assumed you would eventually," she said. "For the visibility." "Partially." He sat at the table. "And because the first task is always a dragon." Hermione set her quill down. "How do you know what the first task is?" "The tournament's historical records describe each iteration. The first task has always been a large, dangerous magical creature, the format varies but the category doesn't. They want to test physical courage and adaptability." He paused. "They're going to put 17-year-old students in front of something that breathes fire and see what happens. And you want to be there." "I want to ensure it doesn't go badly wrong." He looked at her. "I've read the 1792 records. 3 champions were seriously injured. 1 was permanently affected. The hosts called it an acceptable outcome." Something in his voice went flat. "I don't." Hermione looked at him for a moment. "You're going to end it quickly." "Very quickly. In front of everyone." "In front of everyone," he confirmed. "Which means the conversation about what I am starts moving in the direction it needs to move." He had been managing visibility for 3 years, not hiding, but pacing, keeping the rate of revelation calibrated to his readiness and the external threat level. The tournament was the moment to change that calculus. "I'm tired of the pace we're at. The seals are failing faster than the first year," Lumen confirmed. "The timeline has compressed." The Warden Council is getting better at the probe work. Voldemort is, he stopped himself briefly, closer than anyone in this castle wants to admit. Hermione heard the pause. What do you know about Voldemort that you haven't told me? Harry looked at the vault's amber light for a moment. He's been trying to come back for 3 years. More actively than the public understanding of his current state would suggest. The vault records on soul magic are extensive, and the kind of soul magic that would allow someone to survive physical death the way he did, that magic has a signature. I've been tracking it through secondary resonance effects. He paused. He's getting closer. The specific mechanism he's using is something I understand better than probably anyone else alive, and it's going to require direct intervention to stop. Not at the Ministry level. Not at the Order of Phoenix level. He looked at Hermione. At my level. Hermione held his gaze. When? Not this year. Possibly next. He turned back to his work. Which is why the tournament matters. I need to be further out in the open before that conversation becomes unavoidable. Hermione was quiet for a moment, then reached for her quill and returned to the codex notation. She had, in 4 years, developed an extraordinary ability to receive enormous information and continue functioning with it rather than stopping to process. She processed in motion, Harry had noticed, working through implications while her hands stayed busy, her mind running parallel tracks. After a few minutes she said, without looking up, I'll be watching the first task. I know, Harry said. Try not to be unnecessarily dramatic. I make no promises. She made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was, by now, a fully actual laugh, though she would have argued the distinction. The goblet of fire was set up in the entrance hall on a Thursday evening, and the age-line Dumbledore drew around it was a beautiful piece of transfiguration work, clean, precise, layered in a way that Harry respected aesthetically even while noting its fundamental limitation. It was designed to read age, which was the wrong variable. The question wasn't how old someone was. The question was whether they were ready, and readiness and age had a loose and frequently uncooperative relationship. Harry dropped his parchment into the goblet on Friday morning, before breakfast, while the entrance hall was still mostly empty. The goblet flared blue-white when his parchment entered it. Not the usual orange. Not even briefly. A sustained blue-white, cold and clear as lightning, for about 2 full seconds, and the entrance hall felt, for the duration, several degrees colder and several degrees more awake. Harry stepped back from the age line and the goblet returned to its regular warm orange and he adjusted his bag strap and walked to breakfast. 3 students in the entrance hall had watched this happen with various degrees of alarm. He walked past all of them without comment. Word was around the Gryffindor table before he'd finished pouring his pumpkin juice. The Durmstrang contingent arrived first, their ship surfacing from the lake with a drama that Harry appreciated for its commitment. Victor Krum emerged from the ship with the contained composure of a young man who had been famous for 3 years and had learned to carry it without performing it, and Harry found that interesting, the quality of a person who has been made into a symbol and is quietly keeping track of the difference between the symbol and themselves. They made eye contact in the entrance hall the evening the delegations arrived. Krum's eyes were assessing, direct, the look of someone who has met many people and is running a rapid classification. He paused on Harry a fraction longer than he paused on other people, and Harry met the look with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything, and then they both moved on without speaking. Beauxbatons arrived by carriage, enormous and improbable and significantly more stylish than a ship. Fleur Delacour walked into the great hall ahead of her delegation like the concept of intent given physical form. She moved the way people move when they know the room is looking and have decided to find this more convenient than disabling. She was, Harry noted, considerably more interesting than her entrance suggested. There was an intelligence in her eyes that the performance of her arrival somewhat obscured, the look of someone who had learned early that leading with beauty meant other people did the work of underestimating her. She also noticed Harry in a way that was specifically different from the general noticing the hall was doing. He couldn't have defined it precisely, the quality of the glance, maybe, or the fraction of a second the glance lasted. Something that said her assessment of the room had landed on him as a data point that didn't fit her existing model. He was used to that. Hermione, sitting beside him, murmured, "She's part Veela." "I know," Harry said. "Does it affect you?" Harry thought about it honestly. "Not really. I can feel it working, it's a compelling quality, like resonance. But it doesn't override." "Why?" "Because Ron is about to knock over his goblet again and he hasn't even looked directly at her yet." Harry glanced down the table at Ron, who was indeed doing an impressive impression of someone whose motor functions had briefly gone elsewhere. He considered this for a moment. "Should we? He'll be fine," Hermione said, with the airy confidence of someone who has given this exactly the amount of concern it deserves. The champions were selected on Halloween. Victor Krum for Durmstrang. Expected, well earned, carried with the characteristic minimal response. Fleur Delacour for Beaux Batons. Her reaction was a single breath of something, not quite surprise, but not entirely expected either, the look of someone who has wanted something and is recalibrating what wanting it and having it simultaneously feels like. Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts, which produced the appropriate rapturous response from the Hufflepuff table and a good-natured if slightly strained reaction from the rest of the castle. Cedric was, Harry had established over 4 years, exactly as decent as he appeared to be, which was unusual and worth respecting. He had the particular quality of someone whose goodness wasn't a performance or a strategy but a genuine disposition, the kind of person who is kind because they don't know how to be otherwise. Then the goblet flared again. The hall went instantly, completely silent. The fourth piece of parchment floated down through the flame with a quality that was different from the others, not in its motion but in the effect it produced in the air around it, a brief sharpness, the sense of more than usual significance. Dumbledore caught it. "Read it." Looked up, and his face did something careful and controlled that Harry noticed from across the hall. "Harry Potter," Dumbledore said. The silence lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then 400 people started talking at once. Harry walked up from the Gryffindor table through the noise with the unhurried pace of someone who is not surprised and is not performing not being surprised. He was aware of the eyes on him, the Durmstrang delegation measuring him, the Beaux Batons table calculating, the Hogwarts students cycling through various combinations of disbelief and excitement and resentment. He was aware of Dumbledore's expression transitioning through several controlled stages. He was aware of Karkaroff's face doing something sharp and closed. He stopped in front of the judge's table. Dumbledore held out the parchment. "Did you enter your name, Harry?" "Yes," Harry said, clearly, so the nearest 100 people could hear it. "I did." Dumbledore looked at him. The blue eyes were doing careful work. "We will need to discuss this after the task," Harry said. "I'd like to go with the other champions now." A beat. Bartemius Crouch, sitting at the table with the expression of a man who had organized this event and was watching it veer mildly off script, began to speak about the rules, the binding nature of the contract, the requirements. Harry listened to all of it with polite attention and made the appropriate confirmatory responses and followed the other 3 champions into the side chamber. Cedric fell into step beside him in the corridor. "Did you actually enter?" he asked, not accusatory, genuinely curious. "Yes." Cedric absorbed this. "Your 4th year." "I'm aware. The age restriction measures years of life, not magical capability," Harry said. "The goblet determines readiness by a different metric." "It accepted my entry." Cedric was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who is thinking through all the ways he could object to something and arriving at the conclusion that none of them hold. "Right," he said finally. "Okay." And then, with the genuine warmth that was just his baseline mode, "Try not to get burned." "You too," Harry said. He found out about the dragons from Hagrid, which was clearly the path Dumbledore had arranged for the information to reach him through, the route designed for someone who needed coaxing, who needed support, who needed the knowledge offered gently. Harry followed Hagrid to the dragon enclosure on the night of Hagrid's invitation with the benign appreciation of someone accepting a kindness that was offered in good faith, even though he'd known about the dragons for 2 weeks and had been doing considerably more than preparing. The dragons were, in their way, magnificent. 4 of them, a Hungarian horntail, a Chinese fireball, a Swedish shortsnout, a common Welsh green, chained in their enclosure with the furious, pent energy of creatures that had never been designed for captivity and were finding the current arrangements deeply insufficient. Harry watched them from the shadow of the tree line and felt the now familiar dual awareness, the 11-year-old self who had grown into a 14-year-old self, and underneath that the much older thing that looked at the dragons with the specific recognition of someone who had spent a great deal of time in the presence of extraordinary power and knew how to read its body language. The horntail was the dangerous one. Not just most dangerous, specifically dangerous, the difference being intent. The other 3 were responding to captivity and fear. The horntail was responding to those things and something else, a kind of ferocity that was its natural resting state, a creature that was not afraid of anything in that enclosure including its handlers. Harry watched it for a long time. He was not afraid of it either. But he respected it, which was different and more useful. He told Cedric about the dragons the next morning in the corridor before Cedric's history of magic class, delivered clearly and directly because Cedric deserved the information and because it was the right thing to do, and those 2 reasons were sufficient. Cedric looked at him with brief, genuine surprise, and then with something that was close to gratitude and would have been gratitude entirely if it weren't slightly complicated by not knowing what to do with Harry in general. "Why are you telling me?" Cedric asked. "Because I'd want to know," Harry said. "And because you're a decent person who should have a fair chance." He told Fleur through the controlled intermediary of a library encounter he arranged to appear accidental. He placed himself at the table next to her research station at a time he knew she'd be there, and began working through a translation of a text in Old French that he happened to have legitimate reason to review, and when she looked over at the text and her eyes went sharp with recognition, he let the conversation happen naturally. She was, as he'd suspected, considerably smarter than her public presentation, and she picked up the information about the dragons and incorporated it into an existing framework of preparation in about 45 seconds. She looked at him afterward with an expression that was recalculating something significant. "Most boys your age do not do things like this," she said. "I'm not most boys my age," Harry said, and turned back to his translation, and felt her looking at the side of his face for a moment before she gathered her notes with a particular precision that suggested she was having multiple simultaneous thoughts. He did not tell Crumb. Crumb was a Durmstrang champion, and whatever information-sharing arrangement existed among champions, the Durmstrang contingent had their own resources and their own preparation, and Victor Crumb was, Harry had determined by observation, not someone who would have wanted the gesture and would have been made suspicious by it. He confirmed this assessment when Crumb found him in the corridor outside the library 2 days before the task. "You gave Diggory information," Crumb said. "Direct, no framing, the bluntness of someone who has gotten used to being too famous for people to approach him directly and is now demonstrating that he prefers direct." "Yes." "And the French girl?" "Yes." "Not me." "No," Harry said. Crumb studied him. "Why?" "You didn't need it," Harry said. "And you wouldn't have wanted it from me specifically. You have your own preparation and you'd rather it be yours." He held Crumb's gaze. "I'm right about that." Crumb was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a species of respect that was, from Victor Crumb, probably the warmer thing. "You are strange," he said. "I've been told," Harry said. "What are you going to do?" "For the task." Harry thought about the horntail, about the chained dragons in the enclosure, about 17-year-old students being presented to creatures that should never have been penned in the first place. "Something that ends quickly," he said. Crumb looked at him for another moment. "I will watch with interest," he said, and walked away. The morning of the first task, Draco Malfoy cornered him. This was not a surprise. Draco had been building towards something for weeks. Harry had watched the pressure accumulate in him the way you watch weather systems develop, the particular pattern of a person who has competing obligations that are going to require a choice. He was pale under the usual Malfoy composure, and he'd been avoiding Harry's direct line of sight for 3 days, which was itself a kind of signal. He caught Harry in the corridor outside the champion's tent with Crabbe and Goyle flanking him, and for a moment Harry thought this was going to be the usual performance, the sneering, the calculated diminishment, the public relations exercise that Draco's presence at Hogwarts had largely been. Then Crabbe and Goyle went to watch some fourth years doing something with filibuster fireworks further down the corridor, and Draco stood with Harry in the sudden relative privacy, and his face did something it almost never did. It went honest. "Potter," he said, low, the performance gone, the voice about 2 registers more genuine than his usual register. "There's something wrong with the tournament." Harry waited. Draco's jaw worked. "My father. I overheard him. In the summer. There are people who want someone in that arena today, and they're not here for the show." He stopped. Swallowed. Something in his expression was the specific misery of a person who knows something they wish they didn't. "I don't know the details. I know it's not just a task." Harry looked at him. The 4 years of Draco Malfoy had been an education in themselves, the careful study of someone performing a version of himself that his family had designed, the way you perform a role when the alternative is being something your family considers a disappointment. Draco was not what he performed. Harry had known this since roughly October of first year. What he was, underneath the performance, was someone with enough intelligence to see his situation clearly and not yet enough courage to do anything about it. This was, apparently, the beginning of enough courage. "I know," Harry said. Draco blinked. "I've known there was something wrong with the tournament since before the announcement," Harry said. "Not the details of the specific operation, but the broad shape of it." He looked at Draco steadily. "You came to warn me." Draco stopped. "Reset." "Yes." "Why?" The question landed somewhere uncomfortable in Draco's expression. He looked away, looked back, arrived at some internal decision. "Because I think the people my father serves are going to get someone killed today, and I don't want that to be you." He said it with the flat specificity of someone reporting a fact they've checked several times and confirmed. "Whatever you are, Potter, you're not what they think you are, and they're going to find that out too late, and I'd rather you already knew." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Stay visible today," Harry said. "Not in the danger zone. Visible. I want you to see everything clearly." He paused. "And Draco." Draco looked at him. "What you just did took courage," Harry said. "Real courage. Whatever you've been told about yourself, file this against it." Draco's expression moved through something complicated, briefly, before resolving into an approximation of his usual control. It wasn't very convincing. "Don't be sentimental, Potter." "I'm being accurate," Harry said, and went into the champion's tent. The arena was a natural amphitheater on the Hogwarts grounds, the terrain shaped and enclosed over several weeks by the tournament organizers, and it was full. Students from all 3 schools arranged in stands, staff in their designated section, a ministry viewing box that Harry had already mapped in terms of who was in it and what their sightlines were. He stood in the entrance to the arena and looked at the scope of it, the crowd noise, the banners, the morning sky, the grey-blue of cold stone, and felt exactly as calm as he felt in the vault. Cedric had been sent in first. Harry heard the crowd react to the appearance of a Swedish short snout and the subsequent sounds of a well-prepared champion handling it professionally. A roar, several gasps, the sharp collective response to something impressive. He heard Cedric's score announced and the Hufflepuff sections produce their characteristic fervent response. Fleur second. Harry heard the Beauxbatons dragon, the common Welsh green, go strangely quiet after about 3 minutes, heard the crowd's confused murmur, heard the announcement of her score. She'd charmed it, he thought. Put it into a drowsy compliance. Elegant. Very French. Crumb third. The Chinese fireball. Harry heard the crowd go electric in the way they only went for Victor Crumb, who was famous enough that anything he did became instantly legendary in the retelling. 2 minutes, 30 seconds by Harry's estimate. Impressive and decisive. His name was announced for the 4th time in 2 months. He walked into the arena. The Hungarian Horntail was chained to a large boulder at the far end, and its first response to Harry's appearance was the response of a creature that had been watching 3 humans try to get past 3 dragons and had developed opinions about the exercise. It swung its head toward him, the neck spines fully elevated, the tail moving in a slow arc that Harry recognized as the precursor to a sweeping strike. Harry stopped walking. The crowd noise dropped several degrees. This was not standard champion behavior. Standard champion behavior involved rapid movement, pre-prepared strategies, wands already in motion. Harry was standing in the center of the arena with his arms at his sides, looking at the Horntail, not doing anything. The Horntail looked back. Harry had spent 4 years recovering memory and capability. He had not been idle, not in the vault, not in the workroom, not in the quiet practice sessions he ran at 4 in the morning in a section of the 7th floor that the castle helpfully made available to him. He was not the Harry Potter of Lumen's theoretical projections, not yet, not fully. But he was considerably beyond what this arena had expected. He extended his awareness outward, not a spell, not an incantation, a fundamental skill that predated the framework that called itself magic, the ability to make contact with a large magical creature's presence the way you make contact with a person in a room, a quality of attention that said I see you, specifically, not as obstacle or threat but as you. The Horntail went still. Not charmed. Not compelled. It simply went still in the specific way of a creature that has been, for the first time in days, looked at rather than reacted to. Its head dropped slightly, not in submission, nothing about a Horntail ever said submission, but in the recalibration of a very intelligent creature that has encountered something unexpected. The crowd had gone completely silent. Harry walked forward. He walked at a calm pace directly toward the dragon, not veering, not rushing, his wand out now but held loosely at his side, no spell on its tip, and the Horntail watched him come with its golden eyes half narrowed in an expression that was readable as something between wariness and, remarkably, curiosity. He stopped 6 feet from it, close enough that its breath was warm on his face, close enough that its chain links were within arm's reach. He looked at the dragon for a moment. Then he looked at the golden egg, perched on a clutch of false rocks to his left, 10 feet from the dragon's right foreleg, and back at the dragon. The Horntail made a sound. Not a roar. Something lower, more textured, the kind of sound that large creatures make when they are deciding something. Harry held its gaze. He said, not loudly, in a language that the crowd couldn't hear clearly, I am not here for you. I have no wish to hurt you. The egg is not yours. He felt the absurdity of narrating intentions to a dragon, and beneath the absurdity, the absolute certainty that the narration was working anyway, because this creature was old and intelligent and the quality of Harry's attention was a thing it recognized at the level of instinct. Let me take it and I'll leave you in peace. The silence from the crowd had developed a physical quality, the silence of 400 people who have collectively stopped breathing. The Horntail looked at him. It moved its right foreleg. Not away, it moved its right foreleg back, a fraction, just enough to change the angle between its body and the false rocks, just enough to create a clean path to the golden egg. Harry walked past the dragon, picked up the golden egg, and walked back. 12 seconds. The total time in the arena was under 2 minutes, most of which had been the walk in and the walk out. The silence lasted another 3 seconds. Then the arena exploded. Harry walked back through the entrance with the golden egg under his arm and was immediately confronted by a wall of noise that included Cedric gripping his shoulder and saying something Harry couldn't hear clearly, Fleur staring at him with an expression that had moved past recalibration into something new, Crumb standing very still with his arms crossed and an expression that Harry was fairly certain constituted the Crumb equivalent of profound admiration. And Ludo Bagman, who arrived from the judges' section in a state of tremendous excitement and announced his score, 12 points from each judge, an unprecedented 5-judge perfect score, in the voice of a man who was narrating the best thing that had ever happened to him professionally. Harry set the golden egg down and looked at the score display. 60 points. Full marks. Not because of the method, though the method was, by any standard, extraordinary, but because the judges, in their way, had understood what they'd seen. The tournament called for courage. What they'd seen was someone who had walked into a dragon's territory and resolved the situation without harming the dragon or being harmed, using nothing but the oldest and most fundamental of capabilities. Bagman was already talking about writing it into the tournament's historical records. Harry looked across the arena to where Draco Malfoy was sitting in the student stands, and Draco was looking back at him with an expression Harry could read clearly at this distance. It was the expression of someone whose world has reorganized along different axes than the ones they were raised with, and who is doing the work of deciding what to do with that. It was the right expression for Draco to be having. Harry would take it. It was 2 days later that Draco made his second move, and this one was significantly more costly. Harry was in the library when he felt it, not in the way he felt the seals or the castle's ambient communication, something more immediate, more surface level, the specific quality of someone being frightened in a nearby corridor. He'd developed, over 4 years, a sensitivity to this that he couldn't entirely explain and had stopped trying to. He set down his text and went to the door. The corridor outside was the one that ran behind the restricted section, which was narrow and poorly lit and occasionally used by students as a route to avoid the main library traffic. Draco was there, backed against the wall, and there were 2 people in front of him that Harry recognized from their magical signatures before he could see their faces clearly. They were wearing the grey and scarlet of Durmstrang students, but the magic around them had a quality he'd been paying attention to for 4 years, old, layered, the specific texture of people who had grown up with pre-foundational magical knowledge. Warden Council. Not all of them, these were students, probably the children of members, sent as proxies. But trained in the council's methods, which was different from trained at Durmstrang. They had Draco by the wrist. One of them was speaking in a low, rapid voice, something about information, about what Draco had seen and what he might have said, about obligations and consequences and the weight of family standing. Harry walked into the corridor. "Let go of him," he said. The 2 Durmstrang students turned. They were older than Harry, 5th or 6th year by appearance, and they had the look of people who had been trained to assess threats and were currently running that assessment with some urgency. Whatever they found in Harry when they looked at him, it made the one holding Draco's wrist release it immediately, a reflex rather than a decision. "Potter," the other one said, recovering. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Harry said. "You've been operating a probe in this castle for 4 years. I've been watching it. And now you're pressuring a student for information about what he may or may not have told me, which means you've connected me to the seal response in 1991. He looked at them calmly. "You're further along than I realized." The 2 students exchanged a glance that confirmed several things simultaneously. "You know about the seals," the first one said carefully. "I built them," Harry said. The silence in the corridor was absolute. In a previous iteration, he added, because precision mattered. "But the fundamental knowledge base is the same. Which means I know exactly what you're looking for, what it actually is, which is not what your principals believe, and what will happen if you breach the primary containment." He looked at them steadily. "Your council has been operating on a fundamental misunderstanding for 300 years. The thing in the cradle is not a power source. It's a wound. Opening it won't give your families access to power. It will give the wound access to everything." One of them took a step forward. "You can't know, the Codex of Primary Constants," Harry said. Chapter 8a. The one that was removed from every published version. He watched their faces and saw the hit land. They knew about the missing chapter, which meant their principals knew, which meant the information network was considerably more sophisticated than he'd thought. "You know the chapter exists. You don't have it." "I do." He paused. "Come near this student again, and I'll make sure your council understands the entirety of what's in it before they do something irreversible." The implication was clear: the chapter, once understood, would dissolve the motivation behind their 3-century project. It was, in its way, the most powerful threat he could make, because it wasn't a threat of harm but a threat of comprehension. They left. Draco was very still against the wall. His wrist had a mark on it from the grip, nothing lasting, but visible. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was not one thing but was primarily, underneath everything else, the expression of someone who has just been yanked out from under a falling object and is still calculating how close it was. Those were Durmstrang students, Draco said. They were more than Durmstrang students, Harry said. Are you hurt? No. Draco looked at his wrist. They were asking about what I saw during the task. What it meant. What I might have told you. I know. Their manner was. Draco stopped. Harry watched him arrive at something. My father knows these people. Yes, Harry said. I think your father is involved with them peripherally. I don't think he understands what they actually want any more than they understand what they're actually dealing with. He looked at Draco. I'm telling you that so you can calibrate how much information your father has about the current situation, not to diminish him. Draco looked at him for a long moment. There was something working in his expression that was, Harry thought, overdue, a reassessment that had been building since first year, through 4 years of Harry refusing to be what Draco's framework predicted, through the arena, through this corridor. What are you, Potter? Draco said. Not hostilely. With genuine, stripped-down want to know. Harry considered the question for a moment, looking at it from several angles. Someone trying to protect this school, he said. And the things in it. Including you. You don't owe me anything. I know. Harry picked up the bag he'd set down when he came into the corridor. That's why it counts. He walked back to the library. Draco stood in the corridor for a while, Harry suspected, working through whatever that sentence had detonated in him. The golden egg told him what he already knew about the second task in a different language, which was a relief because it confirmed the cipher theory from the vault records, and the cipher confirmed the timeline of the second task, which confirmed that the tournament's escalating structure was matching the historical pattern precisely, which meant someone had access to the original tournament design documents. That was information. He spent 3 evenings in the vault working through the implications with Lumen while Hermione catalogued the mechanical texts and occasionally contributed observations that were, to Harry's knowledge, things no living witch or wizard had thought before, which he told her and which she received with the slightly flustered pleasure of someone who doesn't entirely know what to do with genuine peer-level recognition. The second task is about loss, Lumen said, on the 3rd evening. That's the psychological architecture of it. Take something precious, see if the champion will sacrifice everything to recover it. They'll take someone from each champion, Harry said. Something they'll sorely miss. People, Hermione said, not looking up from her text. They'll take people. Yes, Harry said. They'll take me, Hermione said, with the same tone, still not looking up. Harry looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. Probably. She turned a page. I'll be fine. I know. You'll come and get me. Obviously. She made a note in her margin. Just making sure we'd had that conversation explicitly. Harry looked at Lumen. Lumen's light was at its warmest setting. Harry looked back at his work. Outside, the Scottish winter pressed against the castle, and the lake was cold and deep, and somewhere underneath everything that could be seen, the seals held their long watch in the dark. He thought about his mother's handwriting in the margins of his father's letter. Don't be Aldrich. Be Harry. Whatever that means when you find it. He was finding it. Not in the vault or the workroom or the recovered memories. In this, the amber light, Hermione's quill, the sound of pages turning, the specific quality of being known by someone who has looked at you clearly and stayed. He turned back to the golden egg cipher, and worked.